There is something about Scotland that does not quite fit. Not the mountains, not the lochs, not the ancient castles crumbling into moorland fog. Those things make sense. They belong to the landscape the way stone belongs to a riverbed. What does not fit is the people, the Scots themselves. Because when you go looking for where they came from, when you follow the thread of their ancestry backward through time, past the Jacobite risings, past the wars of independence, past the Roman walls and the Viking raids, you eventually arrive somewhere strange, somewhere unexpected, somewhere that forces you to reconsider everything you thought you knew about the origins of the British Isles. And once you start pulling at that thread, it does not stop unraveling. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. I always check the comments and it genuinely fascinates me. Someone in Edinburgh at midnight, someone in New Zealand at dawn, someone in Canada curled under 3 blankets at 2 in the morning, all of us drifting together through the same ancient mystery. Thousands of miles apart, same darkness, same questions about who we are and where we truly come from. So wherever you are tonight, you are exactly where you are supposed to be. Stay with me. The story begins, as most truly old stories do, not with a name or a date, but with a silence, a gap in the record, a place where the written history simply runs out and something older, stranger, and far more compelling takes its place. Most people, if you asked them where the Scots came from, would say something about Celts. They might mention the Gaels who came across from Ireland, or the Picts who painted their skin blue and terrified the Romans, or the Britons who held the western coast before the Angles pushed in from the east. All of that is true, in the way that the surface of a loch is true. It is real, it is visible, and it tells you almost nothing about what lies beneath. Because beneath all of that, beneath the Gaels and the Picts and the Britons and the Vikings, beneath every name that historians have given to the people of this island, there is something older, something that does not have a name in any textbook. A genetic signature so ancient, so persistent, so stubbornly preserved in certain populations in Scotland and Wales and Ireland that when modern scientists finally had the tools to read it properly, they stopped and looked at each other and said, very quietly, that this does not fit the models we have been working with. It does not fit because the models assumed that the people living in Britain when the Romans arrived were a relatively recent population. Celtic migrants who had pushed into these islands a few thousand years before, replacing or absorbing whoever came before them. That was the story. Celts in, pre-Celtic people out, and whatever was here before them lost to time. Except, they were not lost. They were still here, hidden inside the DNA of the people of Scotland and Wales and the far western reaches of Ireland, passed down in an unbroken chain from parents to children for generation after generation, quietly persisting through every invasion and every conquest and every wave of new settlers, like a heartbeat underneath the noise. The question is, who those people were. And the answer, the real answer, takes you somewhere that most history books do not go. Let us go back, far back, further than the Celts, further than the Bronze Age kingdoms and the Neolithic farmers with their long barrow tombs and their stone circles, further than the first farmers who arrived in these islands from the continent around 6,000 years ago, bringing their cattle and their grain and their entirely new way of living, further even than the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who lived here after the ice retreated, following the deer herds north as the climate warmed. We need to go back to the ice itself, to a time when Britain was not an island at all, but a peninsula jutting off the northwestern edge of a vast cold continent. A time when the sea was locked into glaciers and the land bridge that would one day become the floor of the English Channel and the North Sea was dry ground, inhabited by woolly mammoths and cave lions and small groups of humans who hunted them. This was roughly 20,000 years ago, the last glacial maximum, the coldest point of the last ice age. And at this moment, much of Britain was under ice. Not a light dusting, but a continental ice sheet, kilometers thick in places, grinding southward and flattening everything beneath it. The parts of Britain that were not under ice were not places you would want to live. Treeless tundra, frozen permafrost, temperatures that would kill an unprotected person in hours. The humans who had previously lived in Britain, Neanderthals and early modern humans both, had long since retreated south, following the edge of the habitable world as the cold advanced. Britain was, for thousands of years, essentially empty, waiting. Then the ice began to retreat. Slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, the glaciers began to pull back northward. The tundra softened. Grasses appeared, then shrubs, then sparse forests of birch and pine. Animals moved north ahead of the warming, and the humans followed them. These were the people who would become, in some sense, the first Scots. Not by name, not by culture, not by language, but by presence. By the simple act of being here, in this cold, wild, barely thawed land, before almost everyone else arrived. We do not know very much about them in the way of names or stories or beliefs, because they left no writing. What they left was something more lasting and, in some ways, more honest. They left their bones, and in those bones, they left their DNA. And when modern geneticists began extracting and reading that ancient DNA, they found something that should not, by the conventional narrative, have been possible. They found that a significant proportion of the ancestry of people living in Scotland today, particularly in the Western Highlands and the Islands, can be traced not to the Celtic migrations of a few thousand years ago, but directly back to these earliest post-glacial settlers, people who walked into Britain before the farming revolution, before the Bronze Age, before any of the migrations that are supposed to have replaced the native population. They survived, not as a separate group, not in isolation, but genetically. Their lineages persisted through everything. The farming revolution that replaced most of the hunter-gatherer ancestry elsewhere in Europe barely touched certain pockets of the Western fringe. The Bronze Age migrations from the steppes of Central Asia, which swept across most of Europe and transformed the genetic landscape of Britain, left certain groups in the Scottish Highlands and the Atlantic coast almost untouched. It is one of the most remarkable patterns in the genetic history of Europe, a population that kept coming back, or rather, a population that never truly left. But to understand why this matters, and why it connects to something much larger and stranger than just a local footnote in Scottish prehistory, we need to understand who these people were. Not just their DNA, but their world, their lives. The civilization, if you can call it that, which they built in the 15,000 years between their arrival and the moment when the farmers arrived and began to change everything. 15,000 years is an enormous span of time. To put it in perspective, the entire span of recorded human history, from the first Sumerian tablets to the present day, covers roughly 5,000 years. These people lived in Britain for 3 times that long without writing anything down, and yet they were not primitive in any meaningful sense of the word. They were fully modern humans, anatomically and cognitively identical to you and me, with the same capacity for language and planning and social complexity and creativity. What they did not have was agriculture. They did not plant crops. They did not keep herds of domesticated animals. They did not build permanent villages or cities. They moved with the seasons, following the deer and the aurochs, harvesting hazelnuts in autumn and fishing the river mouths in spring, and knowing the landscape they lived in with an intimacy that settled farmers rarely achieve. And this was not a poverty, this was a mastery. The hunter-gatherer lifestyle, when it exists in a landscape as rich and varied as post-glacial Britain, is not a desperate scramble for survival. It is, as archaeologists and anthropologists have documented in living hunter-gatherer communities around the world, a life with significant leisure time, with rich social structures, with art and music, and ritual and storytelling. The people who first colonized Scotland after the ice retreated were not cavemen in the Hollywood sense. They were sophisticated, adaptive, intelligent human beings who had figured out how to live very well in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. And they loved it here. You can tell, in the way you can sometimes tell things about people without them ever speaking. They came back, generation after generation, even when the climate deteriorated and the forests thinned and the winters grew harder. They adapted. They found ways to survive the rough patches and expand during the good periods. And over those 15,000 years, something happened that almost never happens in human populations. They persisted. In most of Europe, the arrival of farming communities from the Near East around 8,000 years ago was a demographic catastrophe for the hunter-gatherers. Not necessarily violent, though violence certainly happened. More of a slow displacement, a gradual replacement, as the farmers, with their more reliable food supply and their ability to support higher population densities, outcompeted the hunters for land and resources. Within a few thousand years of farming arriving in most regions of Europe, the genetic signatures of the hunter-gatherers had largely disappeared, replaced by the ancestry of the incoming farmers. But not on the Atlantic fringe of Europe, not in the Highlands of Scotland and the mountains of Wales and the coasts of Ireland and the rocky shores of the Basque Country in northern Spain. There, for reasons that are still being studied and debated, the old ancestry persisted. The hunter-gatherers held on, or more precisely, their genes held on, absorbed into the farming communities that arrived, but never quite erased. And those genes are still there today, still readable in the DNA of living people, still whispering about a time before Britain was an island, before anyone called it Britain, before anyone called it anything at all. This is the first layer of the mystery, and it is remarkable enough on its own, but it is only the beginning, because the question of where those earliest people came from, the ones who walked into Britain after the ice, opens up an even older and stranger story. They did not emerge from nothing, they came from somewhere, and tracing that journey takes us to one of the most debated and fascinating questions in all of human prehistory, the question of the Atlantic coast corridor. During the Ice Age, as we have noted, much of northern Europe was uninhabitable. The ice sheets covered everything from Scandinavia down through most of Britain and far into what is now Germany and Poland. The population of Europe was squeezed into a series of refugia, sheltered pockets in the south where the climate remained survivable. Southern France, the Iberian Peninsula, the Italian Peninsula, the Balkans, the area around the Black Sea. In these refugia, for thousands of years, human populations survived. They were small, isolated, and genetically distinct from one another, because the glaciers prevented contact between groups. Each refugium developed its own genetic signature, its own cultural traditions, its own set of survival strategies adapted to its particular environment. And one of these refugia was particularly important for the future ancestry of Scotland, the Iberian refugium. The people who sheltered in what is now Spain and Portugal during the worst of the Ice Age were, genetically speaking, the ancestors of a significant portion of the modern Scottish population. When the ice retreated and the land to the north opened up, these Iberian hunter-gatherers did not simply stay where they were. They moved. Some went east, into France and Central Europe, but others went north, following the Atlantic coast, into the newly exposed land that would become Britain and Ireland. And this movement was not a one-time event. It was a long, sustained process that continued for thousands of years. Wave after wave of migrants following the coastline northward, moving into a landscape that was still being formed, still recovering from the ice, still finding its ecological footing. They brought with them their genes and their culture and their knowledge, which had been refined over tens of thousands of years of life on the southwestern edge of Europe. There is a school of thought, controversial but gaining support, that argues this Atlantic coast movement was more significant than anything that came after, that the genetic bedrock of the British Isles, the layer beneath all the subsequent migrations, was laid down not from the east, not by Indo-European speakers expanding out of the steppes, but from the south, from the Iberian refugium, via the Atlantic corridor, and that this Iberian ancestry is preserved most clearly, most completely, in the populations of Western Scotland and Ireland and Wales. If this is correct, and the genetic evidence increasingly suggests it might be, then the people of the Scottish Highlands and Islands have a direct ancestral connection to the people of prehistoric Iberia that predates almost everything else in the history of the British Isles. They are, in a very real genetic sense, cousins of a people who lived thousands of miles to the south, separated by the length of an entire continent, but united by a lineage so old that it makes the Roman invasion and the Viking raids, and even the Neolithic farming revolution look like recent news. This is what scientists sometimes call the Atlantic Celtic hypothesis, though that name is somewhat misleading because it implies that what binds these populations is Celtic culture, when what actually binds them is something far older than any Celtic culture. It is pre-Celtic, pre-farming, pre-metal. It is Ice Age ancestry expressed in modern DNA. But here is where the story takes its first, genuinely unexpected turn. Because that Atlantic connection, that deep genetic link between the western fringe of Britain and the people of prehistoric Iberia, does not end in Iberia. Follow the genetic signatures of those Iberian hunter-gatherers far enough back, and you end up somewhere that should, by rights, be completely disconnected from the Scottish Highlands. You end up with questions that researchers are only beginning to seriously ask, about connections across vast distances, about migrations that the conventional models say were impossible, about a chapter of human prehistory that we may have only the faintest outlines of. Let us hold that for a moment, because before we get to the truly forbidden territory, we need to understand one more layer of the Scottish genetic mystery, one that is better documented, more recent, and in some ways even more astonishing in its implications. The Picts. If you know anything about early Scottish history, you have heard the name. The Picts are one of the great mysteries of British history, a people who inhabited most of what is now Scotland for at least 1,000 years, who built extraordinary symbol stones covered in carvings that have never been satisfactorily deciphered, who fought off the Romans, and then the Angles, and then the Vikings, and who then, around the 9th century, simply vanished from the historical record, absorbed into the nascent kingdom of Alba that would eventually become Scotland. They left no literature. They left no written accounts of their history or their beliefs. They left those extraordinary stones, those strange carved symbols, fish and crescents, and broken arrows and double discs and zigzag rods, symbols that appear in consistent combinations across hundreds of stones spread across a vast territory, suggesting a sophisticated and stable symbolic system, but not one that anyone has been able to read. Where did the Picts come from? This question has occupied historians and archaeologists for centuries. The Roman writers who first recorded their existence were not particularly helpful. The name itself, Picts, is probably a Latin nickname meaning painted people, which tells you what the Romans noticed about them, the practice of tattooing or body painting, but tells you almost nothing about who they actually were. Medieval Scottish chroniclers, writing centuries after the Picts had ceased to exist as a distinct political entity, filled the vacuum with legend. One tradition said the Picts came from Scythia, the vast steppe region north of the Black Sea. Another said they came from Thrace, in what is now Greece and Bulgaria. A third tradition, popular in Ireland, connected them to a mysterious ancient people called the Cruithne. None of these traditions were meant to be taken as literal historical accounts. They were origin myths, the kind of story that every ancient people tells about themselves to explain where they came from and why they are special. But here is what modern genetics has found, and it is quietly extraordinary. The Picts were not, as some theories had suggested, a recent intrusion into Scotland from continental Europe. Their DNA, read from the bones of individuals buried in undisputedly Pictish contexts, shows a population that had deep, deep roots in the British Isles, roots that connect them to the pre-farming hunter-gatherers, roots that were old when the Celtic languages arrived, roots that go back, in some lineages, to those earliest post-glacial settlers who walked into Scotland before the forests had fully grown. The Picts were, in some sense, the original British. Not the first people in a romantic sense, not the only people, but certainly among the most direct descendants of the earliest inhabitants, people who had been in Scotland for so long that the very concept of being from somewhere else had ceased to have any practical meaning. And yet they had those stones, those extraordinary, baffling, haunting stones with their unreadable symbols. And the question of what those symbols mean and where that symbolic tradition came from opens up something that goes far beyond the local history of a single ancient people in a single ancient land. The Pictish symbol stones are, by any objective assessment, one of the great unsolved mysteries of European archaeology. They appear suddenly, with no clear developmental sequence, around the 4th or 5th century of the Common Era. They are carved on standing stones and on cave walls and occasionally on smaller portable objects. They combine realistic animal carvings, particularly of the Pictish beast, a strange swimming creature that may represent a dolphin or a horse, or something entirely mythological, with abstract geometric symbols that have no obvious parallel in any other artistic tradition. Or rather, they had no obvious parallel, until researchers began looking at the wider picture of prehistoric symbolic traditions around the North Atlantic, and began noticing something uncomfortable. The discomfort comes from the distances involved. Some researchers, working outside the mainstream of academic archaeology, have noted structural similarities between certain Pictish symbols and geometric markings found in sites much older and much further away. in megalithic sites along the Atlantic coast of Europe, in cave art in Spain and France, and, more controversially still, in certain motifs associated with cultures on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. Now, mainstream archaeology treats any suggestion of pre-Columbian contact across the Atlantic with extreme caution, bordering on hostility. The narrative of the Americas, as isolated from the Old World until 1492, is deeply embedded in the academic tradition, even as it has been quietly eroded by evidence from multiple directions. The Norse settlement at Lens-aux-Meadows in Newfoundland, definitively dated to around the year 1000, is now universally accepted. The genetic evidence for contact between South American populations and Polynesian peoples is now established. The story is becoming more complicated, but the suggestion of contact between prehistoric Atlantic Europeans and the Americas, contact that predates the Norse by thousands of years, remains deeply controversial. And yet the evidence, when you look at it honestly, and without the instinct to dismiss what does not fit the accepted model, is not trivial. Let us look at that evidence carefully, because this is where the story of Scottish ancestry connects to something genuinely extraordinary. The people who built the megalithic monuments of Atlantic Europe, the stone circles and the passage tombs and the standing stones that dot the landscape from Portugal to the Orkney Islands, were a remarkable civilization, not a civilization in the urban sense. They had no cities, no writing, no complex bureaucracies, but they had something that many people would argue is more impressive. They had an extraordinarily sophisticated understanding of astronomy and mathematics, encoded in stone structures that have survived for 5,000 years. The stone circles of Orkney, the passage tomb of Newgrange in Ireland, the alignments at Callanish in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland, these are not crude piles of rock. They are precise astronomical instruments designed to track the movements of the sun and moon with accuracy that modern measurements confirm. They required an understanding of geometry, of long-distance surveying, of the movements of celestial bodies across decades and centuries, that demands a level of intellectual sophistication that the old image of primitive prehistoric people cannot account for. And these people, the builders of the megaliths, were genetically connected to the Atlantic population we have been discussing. They were, in large part, descended from those Iberian hunter-gatherers who moved north along the Atlantic coast, and from the first farmers who came out of the Near East but were themselves heavily genetically influenced by their interactions with the hunter-gatherer populations along the coast. The people who built Callanish and Skara Brae and the Ring of Brodgar in Orkney were not random European farmers. They were the product of a specific Atlantic tradition that stretched from Portugal to Shetland, a tradition that was, in its own way, a coherent culture, even if it never had a single name. And this culture, this Atlantic megalithic tradition, built structures that face east to catch the midsummer sunrise and west to watch the midwinter moon, structures that encode the rhythms of the sky in stone with a precision that implies centuries of careful observation and record-keeping. How do you keep records without writing? You pass knowledge down through memory, through ritual, through the careful transmission of precise observational data from one generation to the next. For this to work, you need social structures that value that transmission, that protect it, that treat it as sacred. In other words, you need a priesthood, or something like one. The Druids of Celtic tradition were not the inventors of the megalithic religious tradition. They were, most likely, the inheritors of something far older. The Celtic-speaking peoples who arrived in Britain in the first millennium, before the Common Era, found a landscape already filled with ancient sacred sites, a landscape already organized around astronomical alignments and ancestral burial mounds and stone circles that were already hundreds or thousands of years old. And they seem to have incorporated those sites into their own religious practice, and may have inherited from the people who built them some of the astronomical and cosmological knowledge that those sites encode. This is important for our story because it means the tradition of astronomical knowledge and sacred geometry that is associated with the pre-Christian religious life of Scotland and Ireland and Wales is not a Celtic invention. It predates Celtic culture by thousands of years. Its roots reach back to those Atlantic coast hunter-gatherers and to the megalithic farmers who came after them, to a tradition of skywatching and sacred architecture that was old when Stonehenge was young. And that tradition, that ancient body of knowledge encoded in stone circles and standing stones and passage tombs, shows up in the most unexpected places when you start looking at the broader picture of human prehistory. Here is where we need to talk about something that is rarely discussed in polite academic company. The question of what was happening on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean during the period when the megalithic tradition of Atlantic Europe was at its height, roughly 4,000 to 6,000 years ago, and whether there is any possibility of a connection. The conventional answer is simple: nothing. The Americas were isolated. The people living there, the descendants of those who had crossed from Asia into Alaska during the Ice Age, had no contact with Europe. Full stop. End of story. But the conventional answer has been under sustained pressure from several directions, and the pressure is increasing. Not because archaeologists have found Viking longships on the coast of Maine, though the Norse visits are well documented, but because of a more subtle and ultimately more significant body of evidence: the evidence of ideas. When two cultures that are supposed to have developed in total isolation from each other show up with strikingly similar beliefs, strikingly similar architectural traditions, strikingly similar astronomical knowledge, and strikingly similar symbolic systems, there are three possible explanations: coincidence, parallel independent development arising from the shared nature of human cognition, or contact. The first two explanations are always preferred by mainstream scholarship, for the very good reason that they require the least revision of established models. Coincidence is always possible. Parallel development is demonstrably real. Human beings everywhere, working independently, have invented agriculture, invented mathematics, invented similar religious ideas, invented similar architectural solutions to similar problems. But there are limits to how far parallel development and coincidence can carry an explanation. And when the similarities become very specific, when they involve not general things like building with big stones or watching the stars but very particular details, the same specific astronomical knowledge encoded in the same specific way, the same symbolic vocabulary appearing in the same combinations, the same genetic markers appearing where the models say they should not, the explanations of coincidence and parallel development start to strain. And that strain is exactly what you feel when you look at certain aspects of the archaeological record of the eastern seaboard of North America and hold them up against the Atlantic European tradition. Take, for example, the question of the red ochre. The people of the maritime archaic tradition who lived along the coasts of Atlantic Canada and the northeastern United States from roughly 8,000 to 3,000 years ago had a distinctive burial practice. They buried their dead in graves heavily coated with red ochre, the same iron-rich mineral pigment that was used in exactly the same way by peoples on the other side of the Atlantic from the Paleolithic period onward, including by the megalithic communities of Atlantic Europe. Now, red ochre is widely distributed in nature, and its symbolic association with blood and life and the afterlife has been proposed independently across many cultures. That is a perfectly reasonable parallel development. But the maritime archaic were not just using ochre in a vague, general way. They were using it in burial practices of a specific type, with specific grave goods and specific orientations of the bodies that echo Atlantic European practice in ways that are, at minimum, thought-provoking. And the maritime archaic were, it is now clear, a sophisticated maritime culture. They were among the earliest known users of watercraft, capable of deep-sea fishing in the Atlantic, fishing for swordfish and bluefin tuna in open ocean. They were people who were comfortable far from shore, who understood the sea and its currents, who built boats capable of surviving rough Atlantic waters. They were, in short, exactly the kind of people who could, in principle, have made and maintained contact across the North Atlantic. Could they have had contact with the equally sophisticated maritime peoples of Atlantic Europe? The same Atlantic European peoples whose megalithic tradition shows so many intriguing parallels with North American archaeological cultures. The question cannot yet be definitively answered, but it can be honestly asked, and it is being asked, quietly, by a growing number of researchers who are willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even when it leads somewhere uncomfortable. Let us return to Scotland now, because the connection to this larger story runs through the Scottish genetic record in a way that is worth understanding carefully. The haplogroup that is most characteristic of the ancient Atlantic coast population of Europe, the one that connects the pre-farming hunter-gatherers of Iberia to the Mesolithic inhabitants of Scotland and Ireland, is known in genetic terminology as haplogroup I. Specifically, In the male lineage, haplogroup I2, this is one of the oldest Y chromosome lineages in Europe, predating the Indo-European migrations by thousands of years, predating the farming revolution, predating essentially everything we conventionally think of as European civilization. And this haplogroup, or closely related lineages, shows up in unexpected places when researchers with open minds start looking at the ancient DNA of the Americas, not in large numbers, not in ways that could be explained by post-Columbian European admixture, but in specific, isolated, ancient contexts that demand an explanation the conventional models cannot easily provide. This is not, to be clear, widely accepted science. It is contested, actively debated, and in some cases flatly denied by researchers who believe the contamination of ancient samples is a more likely explanation than actual transatlantic contact. Those concerns about contamination are legitimate and must be taken seriously. Ancient DNA work is technically demanding, and the ghost of European contact post 1492 haunts every analysis of Native American genetics. But the pattern persists across multiple independent analyses by multiple independent researchers using improved techniques that reduce the likelihood of contamination. And the pattern always points in the same direction. The unexpected Old World ancestry in the Americas, when it appears at all in pre-Columbian contexts, tends to come from the Atlantic fringe of Europe, not from the populations of Central or Eastern Europe that supplied most of the post-Columbian immigration. From the specific population that we have been tracking throughout this story, the ancient Atlantic coast people, the ones whose descendants are most concentrated today in Western Scotland and Ireland and Wales and the Basque Country. The implications of this, if it holds up under further scrutiny, are staggering. It would mean that the oldest continuous genetic tradition in Scotland, the lineage that connects living Highland Scots to the very first people who walked into the British Isles after the ice retreated, is the same lineage that made contact with the Americas thousands of years before Columbus, thousands of years before the Norse, in the deep prehistory of the North Atlantic. It would mean that what we call Scottish identity, with its ancient associations with the sea, and with a fierce independence, and with a mysterious pre-Christian spiritual tradition that predates even the Druids, is in some sense an inheritance from the world's most accomplished long-distance maritime culture, a culture that ranged across the entire North Atlantic, from Iberia to Scotland to Iceland to possibly the shores of the New World. This is a large claim, too large, perhaps, to swallow whole. Let us take it in smaller pieces. The sea has always been central to Scottish culture. This is obvious, even trivially so, when you look at the geography. Scotland is a country of coasts. It has more coastline than France, a country several times its size, because of its extraordinary complexity of islands, sea locks, peninsulas, and inlets. The Outer Hebrides, the Inner Hebrides, Orkney, Shetland, the Cape Wrath coast, the Firth of Clyde, the Firth of Forth, the Moray Firth. The sea is everywhere. It defines the country. It defines the culture. And the people of the Hebrides and Orkney and Shetland, the island communities that preserved the oldest genetic signatures most completely, are people whose relationship with the Atlantic is not a recent development. Their ancestors were fishing these waters and navigating these seas and building boats capable of reaching Iceland long before the Norse ever arrived. The Norse, when they came to Orkney and Shetland and the Hebrides, did not find empty islands. They found communities of people with their own sophisticated maritime culture, a culture that had been developing in these waters for thousands of years. Those communities were the inheritors of the Atlantic megalithic tradition. The people who built the Ring of Brodgar in Orkney and the standing stones of Callanish in Lewis and the passage tombs of the Boyne Valley in Ireland, those people were the cultural ancestors of the communities the Norse encountered, however many generations removed and however overlaid with subsequent influences. The thread of continuity is real, even if it is attenuated. And the Ring of Brodgar, let us be very clear about this, is an astonishing structure. It dates to roughly 2500 BCE. It consists of 60 standing stones, of which 27 remain, arranged in a perfect circle 104 meters in diameter. This precision, in a period before surveying instruments, before any form of mechanical measurement, required a mathematical understanding that we are still working out how they achieved it. The same is true of the Callanish stones, which align with the southern moonrise during the major lunar standstill, a phenomenon that occurs every 18.5 years, meaning that the builders required continuous observations across multiple generations to identify and encode this alignment. Who were these people? Not primitive barbarians, not superstitious cave dwellers making random piles of rocks. They were mathematicians and astronomers and engineers, working in a tradition of extraordinary intellectual sophistication, in a landscape that would one day be called Scotland, thousands of years before anyone called it that. Their descendants, the genetic inheritors of their lineage, are still there, in the crofting communities of the Western Isles, in the fishing villages of the Highland coast, in the cities and towns and farms of a Scotland that no longer remembers them by name but carries them in its blood. There is a word in Scottish Gaelic, sianchas, that means something like oral tradition or ancestral knowledge. The great body of stories and genealogies and historical accounts that was preserved by professional storytellers, the Sean Chéad Hían, the hereditary keepers of the spoken record. In medieval Gaelic society, the Sean Shai held a position of enormous social importance. They were the memory of the community, the custodians of its identity, its connection to the past. The knowledge they preserved went back, they claimed, to the beginning of the world, or at least to the beginning of the people, to the time of the great migrations, the coming of the first ancestors to the island of Ireland and then to Scotland, a time so remote that it had become entangled with myth. The old Irish texts, the Lebor Gabala Eren, the Book of the Taking of Ireland, preserve these traditions in a form that is partly historical memory and partly pure mythology, with the exact proportions varying from reader to reader. But embedded in those myths, in those ancient stories that the Sean Chéad Hían passed down through generations of careful memorization, there are hints of things that match, intriguingly and imperfectly, some of what we have been discussing. There are traditions of migrations by sea, from remote regions, involving people with skills and knowledge not possessed by the people they encountered. There are accounts of ancient peoples with mysterious abilities and strange origins. There are genealogies that claim to trace descent to ancestors who came before the flood, before the great catastrophe that reset the world. The mythological tradition preserved in Scotland and Ireland is almost certainly not a literal historical record, but it is just as certainly not pure invention from nothing. Myths encode something, even when they encode it in the language of the supernatural. The specific details of ancestral memory that a culture chooses to preserve, the specific things it considers important enough to pass down across generations of oral transmission, tell you something real about that culture's understanding of its own past. And the myths of the Gaelic tradition consistently point toward the sea, toward distant origins, toward a past that stretches far beyond the reach of ordinary historical record into a time of wonders and great migrations and peoples whose nature was not quite like the nature of those who came after. The Tuatha Dé Danann, the divine people of Irish and Scottish mythology, arrive in Ireland by sea or from the sky, depending on the version of the story. They bring with them 4 great treasures: the Lia Fáil, the Stone of Destiny, the Spear of Lu, the Sword of Nuada, and the Cauldron of the Dagda. They possess knowledge and skills that surpass those of the people already living in Ireland. They can work with light and sound and weather in ways that the older population cannot understand. They are described, in the oldest layers of the tradition, not as gods in the sense of omnipotent beings, but as people, profoundly gifted people, who came from somewhere else and brought something extraordinary with them. Where did they come from? The mythology says they came from 4 mystical cities to the north, cities sometimes interpreted as located in the far northern Atlantic, on islands that may or may not be identifiable with real places. The names of those cities, Phalius, Gorius, Murius, and Findias, have been interpreted in various ways by various scholars, none of whom can say definitively where these places were supposed to be or whether they had any geographical referent at all. But the direction is consistent: north and west, the Atlantic. The direction from which, as we have seen, the oldest ancestry of the Scottish and Irish people actually did arrive, in the form of those post-glacial migrants from the Iberian refugium moving north along the Atlantic coast. Is this a coincidence? Almost certainly, at some level. The mythology is thousands of years younger than the migrations it might be distantly encoding. But the human capacity for preserving ancestral memory in story form is real, and it operates over longer timescales than is sometimes assumed. There are documented cases of oral traditions, preserving accurate geographical and ecological information about events that happened 10,000 years or more in the past. The Aboriginal Australian traditions that preserve memories of sea level rises at the end of the last ice age are the most striking examples, but they are not unique. If the Gaelic tradition preserves, in however distorted and mythologized a form, some memory of the great migrations of the post-glacial period, of seafaring peoples arriving from distant lands with extraordinary knowledge, then what the mythology is describing may be a genuine, if vastly transformed, recollection of the deep ancestral history that the genetics is now uncovering. The Stone of Destiny is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it brings us to something concrete and strange and historically attested that connects the mythological tradition directly to the political history of Scotland in a way that is rarely examined from this angle. The Stone of Destiny, or Lia File, or Stone of Scone as it is also known, is a block of sandstone that was used for centuries as the coronation seat of Scottish kings, and then, after its capture by Edward I of England in 1296, of English and then British monarchs. It was returned to Scotland in 1996, though it is brought back to London for coronations, as it was for the coronation of Charles III in 2023. The conventional account of the stone is that it is a fairly unremarkable piece of local sandstone that was used as a portable throne and became politically and symbolically important due to the prestige of the kings who sat on it. The mythology that surrounds it, the legends connecting it to the biblical patriarch Jacob and to ancient Ireland and to Scotland's mythological past, are understood as later embellishments, stories that accumulated around an object that was important for practical political reasons. But there is another tradition, older and stranger, that connects the stone to a much deeper past. In the mythology of the Tuatha De Danann, the Lia Fáil was brought from the mystical city of Phalius by those ancient seafarers as one of their 4 divine treasures. It was the stone on which the High Kings of Ireland were inaugurated, and when the rightful king stepped onto it, it cried out in recognition. The Scottish royal tradition claimed that this same stone was brought from Ireland to Scotland by Fergus Mór mac Iarc, the founder of the kingdom of Dalriata in the 5th or 6th century, and that it was the stone on which the Dalriata kings were crowned, and eventually all the kings of Scotland. Whether the stone that Edward I captured and that now resides in Edinburgh Castle is the original stone, or whether the monks of Scone substituted a plain local stone before Edward's soldiers arrived and the real stone is hidden somewhere, is a question that has been debated for 700 years and remains unresolved. But what is interesting for our purposes is not the specific object, but what the tradition says about it. The tradition says that the legitimacy of the ruler of Scotland, the connection between the king and the land, was encoded in an ancient stone that came from across the water, from a tradition older than any in the historical record, associated with a people of mysterious origins who brought extraordinary knowledge to the Atlantic coast of Europe. This is not a trivial mythological detail. This is a statement about where Scotland's deepest identity comes from. Not from Rome, not from the Celtic migrations, not from any of the historical peoples who are usually cited as the ancestors of the Scottish nation. From somewhere older, from the sea, from a tradition so ancient that by the time anyone was writing anything down, it had already become mythology. The kings of Scotland understood themselves, through the story of the stone and through the elaborate genealogies that the Saonchéad Hain constructed for them, as the inheritors of something that went back to the very beginning, something that connected them, through an unbroken chain of generations, to the first people who ever came to these islands and the maritime tradition those people brought with them. And the genetics tells us that this is not entirely wrong, not in the mythical sense, of course. The kings of Scotland were not literally descended from the Tuatha De Danann, whoever or whatever those beings were supposed to be. But the genetic lineage that runs through the Scottish population, the deep ancient Atlantic coast ancestry that we have been tracing, really is older than Britain, really is older than any of the named peoples of historical record, really does connect the living people of Scotland to a time before the island was an island, before anyone thought of this land as a place with a name or a history or a political identity. There is something moving about this, when you sit with it. The proud insistence of Scottish identity, the fierce preservation of a distinctiveness that survived centuries of English political pressure and cultural assimilation, The tenacity with which the Gaelic language and Highland culture held on in the face of forces that should have erased them, this is not just stubbornness. It is the expression of something genuinely very old, something encoded not just in culture and language and story, but in the actual biological inheritance of a people who have been here, in one form or another, for a very, very long time. But let us go further still, because the story does not end with Scotland's borders. The Atlantic tradition that produced the megalithic monuments of Orkney and the Outer Hebrides was not a local phenomenon. It was part of a network that stretched the full length of the Atlantic coast of Europe, from the Gulf of Cadiz to the top of Shetland. And the question of whether that network ever extended further, across the Atlantic itself, is one of the most fascinating and contested questions in all of prehistory. Let us talk about boats, because everything about this story ultimately comes down to boats. The common assumption about prehistoric seafaring is that it was limited, that the people of 5 or 10,000 years ago did not have the technology to make long ocean voyages, that they were confined to coastal paddling and shallow water fishing, and that the idea of a sustained crossing of the North Atlantic is anachronistic, a projection of later capabilities onto an earlier period. This assumption is wrong. We know it is wrong because of the actual evidence of what prehistoric people did achieve at sea. Australia was settled by modern humans at least 65,000 years ago. To get to Australia, those people had to cross open ocean. Not the full breadth of the Pacific, but multiple crossings of open water, some stretches tens of kilometers wide, in a period when the sea levels were lower but the basic challenge of ocean navigation still existed. They did it. Somehow. We do not know what boats they used because boats of that period, made from organic materials, do not survive in the archaeological record. But the evidence that they made those crossings is undeniable. The people were there. The Pacific was settled by the Lapita peoples and their descendants across the entirety of its width, from island Southeast Asia to Hawaii and Easter Island and New Zealand, in a series of voyages that involved navigating thousands of miles of open ocean with no instruments except knowledge of stars and currents and swell patterns. They did this with sophisticated double-hulled sailing vessels, and they did it beginning roughly 3,000 years ago, with some of the most distant voyages happening within the last 1,000 years. The North Atlantic, compared to the Pacific, is not particularly wide. The shortest routes, via the Faroe Islands and Iceland and Greenland, involve hops of at most a few hundred kilometers over open water. These routes were followed by the Norse, and probably by Irish monks before them. Brendan's navigation, the legendary voyage of St. Brendan in a currach, a traditional Irish skin boat, across the Atlantic. It was taken seriously enough by Tim Severin in the 1970s that he actually built a replica currach and sailed it successfully from Ireland to Newfoundland, demonstrating that the journey was physically possible in exactly the kind of boat that Atlantic Europeans had been building for thousands of years. The currach, a boat made from a wooden or wicker frame covered in animal skin, is one of the oldest boat designs in the world. Boats of this general type, or their equivalent in different materials, have been used by maritime peoples around the world for tens of thousands of years. The coracle, the kayak, various types of skin boats all represent a widespread and very old technology. And the specific currach tradition of the Irish and Scottish coast is ancient, not just a few hundred years old. Ancient in the sense that the people of the Atlantic fringe have been building and using boats of this type for as long as we can trace their presence in these islands. Could a currach make it across the North Atlantic? Severin's voyage proved that the answer is yes, with appropriate weather and navigation. Is it comfortable or easy? Absolutely not. But comfortable and easy are not the criteria by which we should judge what prehistoric maritime peoples were capable of. They were capable of whatever their environment and their survival needs required of them. And the environment of the North Atlantic, with its rich fishing grounds and its island stepping stones and its seasonal patterns of weather and current that a skilled navigator could learn to read, did not make transatlantic voyaging impossible. It made it difficult. Everything these people did was difficult. The question is whether there is actual evidence that they did it, and the evidence, as we noted earlier, is contested but real. The red ochre burial traditions, the genetic signatures, the structural parallels in astronomical knowledge and symbolic systems. The anomalies in the archaeological record of the northeastern coast of North America that do not fit neatly into the standard models of a purely Asian-derived population developing in complete isolation. None of this evidence is conclusive in isolation. Together, it forms a pattern that is difficult to dismiss entirely and that points consistently in the same direction. The same direction the Atlantic migrations always point, north and west, toward the edge of the known world, toward the horizon that the people of the Scottish Islands and the Irish coast have been looking at for 15,000 years. And what is on the other side of that horizon? What did they find, if they found anything? What contact, if any, did they make with the peoples on the other shore? This is where honest scholarship has to admit its limits. We do not know. We cannot say with certainty that transatlantic contact happened. We can say that the evidence for it is accumulating, that it is not as easily dismissed as it once seemed, and that the history of prehistoric humanity has a pattern of repeatedly turning out to be more complex, more interconnected, and more impressive than the previous generation of scholars assumed. What we can say is this: the people of Scotland, particularly of the Western Highlands and Islands, carry in their DNA a lineage that goes back to the very first inhabitants of these islands after the ice retreated. Those inhabitants came from the Atlantic coast of Iberia, the southwestern corner of Europe, and they were part of a maritime culture that ranged across the full length of the Atlantic fringe. That culture, over thousands of years, built monuments that demonstrate extraordinary astronomical and mathematical knowledge. That culture is connected, through deep genetic ties, to some of the most intriguing anomalies in the prehistoric record of the North Atlantic. When you are in the Outer Hebrides on a clear night, standing among the Callanish stones with the Milky Way overhead and the Atlantic stretching westward to the horizon, you are standing in the exact place where this story is most concentrated. The stones around you were put there by people who were descended from some of the oldest inhabitants of these islands. The sea in front of you is the sea their ancestors crossed to get here, and may have crossed again, heading further west than the conventional histories acknowledge. The lineage is unbroken. From those first post-glacial settlers to the Picts, to the Gaels, to the Scots, the names change, the languages change, the political structures change beyond recognition. But the DNA, the oldest and most persistent thread of identity, runs straight through. Scots carry something in their blood that is older than the name Britain, older than the concept of England, older than anything that history, as conventionally understood, has a name for. That is not a romantic exaggeration. That is what the genetics says. That is what the archaeology, read carefully and honestly, suggests. That is what the mythology, at its deepest levels, seems to be reaching toward, in the way that myth always reaches toward something true that it cannot say directly. The bloodline is real, it is old, and it points toward a past that we are only beginning to understand. Now let us go deeper into the Pictish mystery, because we have circled it several times without fully entering it, and it deserves more careful attention than it usually gets. The standard academic account of the Picts tends toward one of two positions. Either they were simply a regional variant of the Celtic population that inhabited most of Britain and Ireland in the pre-Roman and Roman periods, culturally and linguistically similar to other Brittonic or Celtic peoples but politically distinct, or they were something genuinely anomalous, a non-Celtic population that somehow survived in Scotland while Celtic culture swept over most of the rest of the island. The truth, as modern research suggests, is something between and beyond both of these positions. The Picts were genetically diverse, as any population is. They included individuals whose ancestry connected them to the pre-farming inhabitants of Scotland, individuals whose ancestry reflected the farming revolution, and individuals whose ancestry reflected the later Bronze Age steppe migrations that brought Indo-European languages and R1b Y chromosome lineages to Britain. They were not a pure remnant of some earlier population. They were a mixed population, like all real populations. But they were mixed in a specific way, in a specific place, over a specific set of conditions. And the result was something that was clearly distinct from the Romanized Britons to the south, from the Gaels, who were arriving in the west from Ireland, from the Angles, who would eventually colonize the east. They had their own identity, powerfully expressed and fiercely maintained. That identity found its most concentrated expression in those symbol stones. And the symbols on those stones are, to this day, one of the most baffling puzzles in European archaeology. Consider what we know about them. The symbols appear in consistent combinations, suggesting they represent specific concepts or specific identities, perhaps names or lineages or territorial claims. They appear across a wide area of Scotland, from the northern tip of Shetland to the Firth of Forth, suggesting a shared symbolic language used across a large and politically divided territory. They appear on stones that are clearly designed to be visible in the landscape, suggesting they were intended to communicate something to people who would pass by them and who would understand what they said. They do not appear to be purely decorative. The combinations are too consistent and too specifically constrained for that. The same symbols appear together repeatedly, in the same orientations, while other combinations never appear at all, suggesting grammatical rules of some kind. A structured system of meaning rather than random artistic choice. This looks, in other words, like writing, or at least like a proto-writing system, a set of symbols with assigned meanings used to communicate specific information. But no one can read it. Not for lack of trying. Some of the finest minds in Celtic studies and early medieval archaeology have spent decades attempting to crack the Pictish symbol system, and none of them has produced an interpretation that has gained general acceptance. Why is it so hard? Because unlike the decipherment of Linear B, where the scholars at least knew what language they were looking for, or the hieroglyphs, where a bilingual inscription provided a key, the Pictish symbols give us no key. We do not know what language the Picts spoke, though it was probably related to the Brittonic Celtic languages. We do not know whether the symbols represent sounds or words or something else entirely. We do not know enough about Pictish society to make confident guesses about what kinds of information those stones were communicating. What we do know, or at least what some researchers have argued with considerable supporting evidence, is that the symbols are not arbitrary. They encode something. They communicate something that was important enough to the Picts that they carved it into stone repeatedly, across a wide territory and a long period of time. Something worth preserving, something worth making permanent. One intriguing possibility, and it is only a possibility, is that some of the symbols encode astronomical information. The consistent appearance of certain symbols in certain contexts, particularly the crescent and V-rod, the double disc and Z-rod, which appear more frequently than any other symbol combinations, has led some researchers to wonder whether they might represent cycles of celestial bodies. The crescent is an obvious lunar symbol in virtually any culture. The V-rod and Z-rod might represent trajectories or events in the sky. If the Picts were the inheritors of the ancient astronomical tradition of the Atlantic megalithic people, as their genetic ancestry suggests they partly were, then it is not outlandish to think that their symbol system might be encoding, in a new and compressed form, some of the astronomical and cosmological knowledge that the stone circle builders had been accumulating for millennia. This would make the Pictish stones not just territorial markers or genealogical records, but repositories of knowledge, encoded in a form that the initiated could read and the uninitiated could not. A system that would serve both practical purposes, marking land and identity, and esoteric purposes, preserving ancient knowledge in a form that could survive political change and cultural upheaval. Which is exactly what it did survive. The kingdom of the Picts was absorbed into the kingdom of Alba in the 9th century, traditionally dated to the reign of Kenneth MacAlpin, though the process was almost certainly more complex and gradual than the traditional account implies. The Picts vanished as a political entity. Their language stopped being spoken, replaced by Gaelic. Their name stopped appearing in the chronicles. But those stones are still standing, hundreds of them, scattered across the landscape of Scotland, carved with symbols that no one can read, preserving something that no one can yet interpret. Whatever the Picts wanted to communicate, they wanted to communicate it badly enough to put it in stone. Whatever knowledge those symbols encode, it was important enough to carve permanently into the landscape of Scotland. And that landscape is still there. And the stones are still there. And the people descended from the Picts, carrying in their DNA the ancient lineages that connect them to the very first inhabitants of Scotland, are still there. Let us talk now about the Druids, and what their tradition preserves that might illuminate this older past. The word Druid is almost certainly not Celtic in origin. It has been connected etymologically to the Proto-Celtic word for oak, and the idea of the Druids as oak worshippers and forest priests has been influential in the popular imagination. But the etymology is contested, and even if it is correct, It does not tell us where the Druidic tradition itself came from. What we know from Roman sources is that the Druids were the intellectual and religious elite of the Gaulish and British Celtic societies. They served as priests, as judges, as astronomers, as keepers of the oral tradition, and as intermediaries between the human and divine worlds. They trained for up to 20 years, memorizing enormous bodies of oral literature, because the Druids, famously, refused to commit their knowledge to writing. Not because they could not write. The Celtic peoples were literate in the sense of having access to writing systems, but because they believed that writing down sacred knowledge would diminish it, would make it accessible to those who had not earned it through the long process of initiation and study. This refusal to write is itself a clue. It suggests that what the Druids were preserving was something that could not be reduced to text without losing something essential, something that was embodied knowledge, knowledge transmitted through voice and memory and ritual practice, knowledge that required the context of the tradition itself to be properly understood. What was that knowledge? We know from classical sources that it included astronomy, particularly the calculation of the calendar, and that Druidic calendar reckoning was sophisticated enough to command respect from Greek and Roman writers who were themselves working in a tradition of advanced astronomical knowledge. We know it included a complex philosophy of the soul and the afterlife, including the doctrine of metempsychosis or transmigration of souls. We know it included what can only be called magic, though that word covers a multitude of practices, some of which were clearly understood by the Druids themselves as the application of natural knowledge rather than supernatural power. What the Druids knew, they learned from their predecessors, and their predecessors learned it from theirs. The chain of transmission goes back, unbroken in principle, to a time before the Celtic languages arrived in Britain, before the farming revolution changed the landscape, before any of the historical peoples we know by name were here. At some point in that chain of transmission, the knowledge being passed down would have been the knowledge of the megalithic builders, the sky watchers who aligned Callanish to the southern moonrise, the engineers who laid out the ring of Brodgar with geometric precision, the architects of the passage tombs who positioned the corbelled roofs so that the light of the winter solstice sunrise would shine down the long entrance corridor and illuminate the back chamber for just a few minutes each year. That knowledge did not disappear with the end of the megalithic tradition. Knowledge transmitted orally, in a culture that treats its transmission as sacred, is remarkably robust. The Aboriginal Australian example is the most striking case we know of, but the principle is general. Important knowledge, embedded in ritual and story and practice, can survive for extraordinarily long periods, thousands of years, perhaps, in the most remarkable cases, tens of thousands of years. The Druids may have been, in some sense, the last custodians of the oldest intellectual tradition in Britain, a tradition whose roots lay not in the Bronze Age or the Neolithic, but in the deep past of the Atlantic maritime culture. The people whose descendants now live in the Western Highlands and Islands of Scotland, carrying in their DNA the oldest surviving lineages in the British Isles. When the Romans destroyed the Druidic centre at Anglesey in 60 CE, they were not just suppressing a religious tradition, they were breaking a chain of transmission that went back, in some form, to the dawn of human habitation in these islands. When the Christian missionaries converted the Scottish and Irish kingdoms in the centuries that followed, they absorbed, displaced, and transformed what remained of that ancient tradition, preserving some things in the new form and losing others entirely. But the genetics persisted. The DNA that connects the living people of the Western Highlands to the first inhabitants of post-glacial Scotland survived every conquest and every conversion and every attempt to erase it. It is still there, waiting to be read, waiting to be understood. And this brings us to something that I think is the most important point in this whole long story. Something that is so obvious, once you see it, that it seems strange it needs to be said at all. The people of Scotland, like all people, have a tendency to understand their identity primarily through the historical and cultural record, through the names and stories and events that are preserved in documents and monuments and living tradition, the Jacobite risings, the Highland clearances, the poetry of Burns, and the novels of Scott, the Declaration of Arbroath, the battles of Bannockburn and Flodden. These are the things that Scottish identity is most consciously built on, and they are all, in the long view, extremely recent. The oldest of them goes back barely 800 years. The rest are more recent still. But the DNA goes back 15,000 years. The unbroken genetic thread that connects a person in the Scottish Highlands to the very first people who walked into this land after the ice retreated spans 300 times the length of Scotland's documented history. It connects living people to a world so different from ours that even imagining it requires a fundamental shift in perspective. A world without writing, without metals, without settled communities, without agriculture, without any of the things we use to define civilization, but full, nevertheless, of the same human needs and capacities that drive us now. The need for community, the need for meaning, the need to understand the sky and the sea and the passage of time, the capacity for art and music and story and love and loss and wonder. Those people are not gone. They are in the DNA of the people who live in Scotland now. Not all of Scotland, and not only Scotland. The lineages spread and mix, and the further east and south you go, the more they are diluted by later arrivals. But in the western fringe, in the islands and the highlands, the oldest thread is still there, still present, still readable in the molecular record of cells and chromosomes and the ancient copying mechanisms that preserve genetic information across millennia. This is what it means to say that the Scots carry a bloodline older than Britain itself, not a metaphor, not a romantic exaggeration, a literal, testable, scientifically verifiable fact about the genetic history of a real population of real people. The bloodline is older than Britain. It is older than the name Britain, older than the concept of Britain, older than the physical island of Britain as it currently exists, because the land bridge to continental Europe was still dry when the first ancestors of the modern Scottish population arrived here. They walked here, before it was an island, before the sea rose and cut it off from the continent. They walked in from the south and west, following the retreating ice and the returning forests and the animals that fed on the new growth, and they stayed. Through everything that came after, through the farming revolution and the Bronze Age and the Iron Age and the Romans and the Angles and the Vikings and the Normans, through the union of the crowns and the union of the parliaments and everything that came after. Through all of it, they stayed. Their genes stayed. That is a kind of endurance that dwarfs anything in the written record. That is a kind of belonging to a place that makes every subsequent claim to ownership look provisional by comparison. And it connects, through the pathways we have been exploring, to something even larger, to the question of whether those ancient Atlantic maritime people, the builders of the stone circles and the passage tombs, the seafarers who ranged from Iberia to Orkney and possibly beyond, left any trace of themselves on the other side of the ocean, to the question of whether the ancestry that is most deeply embedded in the Scottish population is the ancestry of people who knew the North Atlantic in ways that we have not fully reckoned with. These questions do not have definitive answers yet. The science is still young. The ancient DNA work is still in its early stages. The re-examination of the archaeological record of the North Atlantic is still ongoing. The willingness of mainstream scholarship to seriously consider the evidence for pre-Norse transatlantic contact is still, to put it diplomatically, limited. But the questions are real, the evidence is real, the mystery is real, and the people at the center of it, the people who carry in their bodies the oldest continuously preserved genetic legacy in the British Isles, are real people living in a real place, fishing the same waters and walking the same coastlines, and looking at the same western horizon that their ancestors have been looking at for 15,000 years. If you ever have the chance to stand at the Callanish stones at dusk, as the light fades over the outer Hebrides and the Atlantic darkens to the west, you might feel something that is difficult to name. It is not exactly history, because what you are feeling does not belong to history in the conventional sense. It is older than that. It is the presence of time itself, enormous and patient, pressing down through the stones and up through the ground and in through the cold salt air. Those stones were put there by people who are, in the most literal genetic sense, the ancestors of the people who live nearby. Not symbolic ancestors, actual biological ancestors, people from whom an unbroken line of descent leads to the present day. The same blood, the same lineage, the same thread, running unbroken for 5,000 years since those stones were raised, and for 10,000 years before that. The Scots did not just inherit a land, they did not just inherit a culture and a language and a history. They inherited a lineage, a biological connection to the deep past of this place that is older than any of those things. Older than Scotland, older than Britain, older than anything we have a name for. That lineage connects them to the Atlantic maritime culture that spread along the western edge of Europe, to the people who built monuments aligned to the moon, and who ranged across the open sea in skin boats, and who encoded their knowledge in stone because they understood that stone outlasts memory. To a tradition of sky-watching and seamanship and esoteric knowledge that may have extended further than the historical record acknowledges. And that lineage connects them, through those ancient Atlantic seafarers, to questions that are still being asked and still being answered about the deepest history of the human presence in the North Atlantic, about who was here first, about what they knew, about how far they went. The story is not finished. It is still being written in genetics, laboratories, and archaeological field sites, and in the communities of the Western Highlands and Islands, where the oldest lineages are still living, still breathing, still looking westward over the sea. Britain was named by others. The Romans gave it its name from the people they found here, who called themselves the Britannicae or the Britanni, a name that may have been what the Picts called themselves, which comes round to a beautiful circularity. The people who are arguably the most ancient biological inhabitants of Scotland, the ones whose genetic heritage goes deepest and oldest in this land, may be the very people who gave the whole island its name in the first place. The blood that flows in the veins of the people of the Scottish Highlands, the blood that geneticists trace back to the hunter-gatherers of the Iberian refugium, to the post-glacial settlers who walked into an empty land, to the builders of Callanish and Skara Brae, and the Brocks and the Duns of the Atlantic coast, that blood is the blood of the original Britons. Of the people who were here before anyone called it Britain, who will be here, in some genetic sense, long after whatever name we give it next. This is what it means to carry a bloodline older than Britain itself. Not a claim of superiority, not a political statement about who belongs here and who does not. Simply a statement of fact, arrived at through the patient work of science and the honest reading of evidence about a genetic continuity that runs so deep and so long that it makes the conventional categories of national identity look like the most superficial of recent inventions. Scotland is old, older than its name, older than its history, and the people who are most genetically continuous with its deepest past are still there, on the Atlantic coast, on the islands, in the Highlands, looking westward over the water toward a horizon that their ancestors looked at 15,000 years ago. Whatever was on the other side of that horizon, whatever those ancient mariners found or did not find when they pushed out beyond the familiar seas, it is part of the story, part of the mystery, part of the long, slow unfolding of a human past that is stranger and richer and more connected than the conventional histories have led us to believe. The thread is still there, still running, from the first footstep on the frozen tundra of post-glacial Scotland to the present moment, from the first ancestor who looked at the western sky and set a stone in alignment with the moon to the last Shan-Che who memorized the genealogies of kings. It does not end, it continues, into the living people, into their children, into a future that will read these old lineages with tools we do not yet have and understand things we cannot yet imagine. The blood is older than Britain. The story is older than Scotland, and it is still being told. Let us now look more carefully at one particular thread within this larger tapestry, one that has been less studied than it deserves, and that connects some of the most specific and concrete evidence we have to the broader picture we have been building. The haplogroup R1bM269 lineage is the dominant Y chromosome line in Western Scotland and Ireland and Wales and the Basque country. This is the lineage that is most often associated with Celtic identity, with the Bronze Age migrations from the steppes. And it is, in fact, partially that. The R1b lineage as a whole expanded out of the Pontic steppe around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, with the Yamnaya and corded were peoples who brought Indo-European languages to Europe. But here is what is fascinating. The specific variant of R1b that is concentrated in the Atlantic fringe, the M269 subclade L21, which is sometimes called the Atlantic modal haplotype, has a distribution that does not match the steppe migration model very well. It is too strongly concentrated in the Atlantic fringe, too absent from the Eastern and Central European regions where the steppe people came from and first settled, too prevalent in exactly the populations that the genetics tell us are most continuous with the pre-steppe Atlantic coast culture. The most parsimonious explanation, the one that fits the data most cleanly, is that the R1BL21 lineage was either present in Atlantic Europe before the steppe migrations, or that it arrived very early and immediately became established in a pre-existing Atlantic coast population that was already culturally and socially coherent. In either case, what you get is a picture of a population that absorbed the incoming steppe lineages but maintained its cultural and demographic coherence in a way that the populations of Central and Eastern Europe did not. The Atlantic fringe did not simply receive the steppe migrations and become new people. It incorporated those migrations into an existing framework, an Atlantic coast identity that was already ancient and already culturally powerful. The incoming people brought new genes, new languages, new technologies, but the culture they encountered was not a blank slate. It was the culture that had built the stone circles. It was the culture that had developed the astronomical tradition. It was the culture that had been living on and navigating the Atlantic for thousands of years. And that pre-existing culture shaped what the steppe migrants became. In Eastern Europe, the steppe people's descendants eventually became the Romans and the Greeks and the Germanic peoples. In the Atlantic fringe, they became the Gaels and the Britons and the Picts. Different, distinctly different. Not just because of geography, but because of what they encountered when they arrived, because of the depth and coherence of the Atlantic tradition that was already here. This is why Scotland is different. Not just culturally different, not just linguistically different, but in some genuinely measurable way, ancestrally different. The mix that produced the Scottish Highlands population is not the same mix that produced any other population in Europe. It contains ingredients that are unique to the Atlantic fringe, ingredients that go back to the beginning of human habitation in this part of the world. And one of those ingredients, the one that shows up most clearly in the deepest layers of the genetic record, is the Iberian hunter-gatherer ancestry that we have been tracking from the beginning. The ancestry that came north from the refugium. The ancestry that predates farming. The ancestry that connects the Scottish Highlands to an Atlantic maritime tradition so old that it has no name we recognize. Let us think for a moment about what 15,000 years of continuous presence in a landscape does to a people. Not politically, not culturally in the conventional sense, but ecologically, cognitively. In terms of the relationship between a human population and the specific place it inhabits, 15,000 years is roughly 500 to 700 human generations, depending on what average generation length you use. That is an enormous number of generations to be in one place. To be fishing the same waters, walking the same coastlines, watching the same sky, learning the patterns of the same weather systems, the same currents, the same seasonal rhythms. In that time, a population develops a kind of knowledge about its environment that is not easily put into words because it is not primarily verbal. It is embodied knowledge, encoded in instinct and intuition, and the kind of practical skill that is learned by doing over so many generations that it ceases to feel like knowledge at all and starts to feel like nature, like the way things simply are. The fishermen of the Western Isles know the sea in this way, not intellectually, in their hands and their bodies and their sense of what the weather will do in the next few hours. They know it the way you know the layout of your own house in the dark, without thinking, by feel. That knowledge is not something they learned from a book or developed in a single lifetime. It is the accumulated product of thousands of years of people learning the same waters, passing what they learned to their children, generation after generation, until it became, in some sense, part of what it means to be from here. This is what is at stake when the last speakers of a minority language leave, or when the last fishing community of a remote island is cleared for sheep or tourism. It is not just a cultural loss, though it is certainly that. It is the loss of an ecological knowledge base that took millennia to develop, a knowledge that is irreplaceable because it was built by people who lived in continuous relationship with a specific place over a span of time so long that we can barely imagine it. The clearances, the forced displacement of highland and island communities in the 18th and 19th centuries to make way for sheep farming were not just a social catastrophe. They were, in the deepest sense, a geological event. They removed people who had been in relationship with that landscape for 15,000 years and replaced them with animals, and they did it in a few decades. What was lost cannot be fully recovered, but it can be honored, and part of honoring it is understanding how deep it goes. Understanding that the people who were cleared from Sutherland and Knoydart and the islands of the Outer Hebrides were not recent settlers who had arrived in the medieval period and had a century or two of local knowledge to draw on. They were the direct biological descendants of people who had been in that landscape since before the sea rose, since before the forests grew back, since before any of the other peoples of Europe had arrived on the scene. Their knowledge was older than Britain. Their connection to the land was older than Scotland. The thread of their presence in that place ran back, unbroken, to the very beginning of human habitation in the British Isles. That is what was cleared, that is what was lost, and the people who were cleared carry it still, scattered across the world in the Scottish diaspora, in Canada and Australia, and New Zealand, and the United States. Wherever the clearances and the famines and the economic pressures of the last 3 centuries sent them, they carry it in their DNA, whether they know it or not. The oldest lineages in the British Isles, transplanted to the far corners of the world, still traceable, still readable, still connected through the molecular record to a specific coastline on the Atlantic edge of Europe, where their ancestors stood and watched the sun go down over the water for 15,000 years. This is the true measure of the Scottish diaspora. Not just the spread of a culture across the world, though that is remarkable enough, but the dispersal of a genetic legacy that is, quite literally, irreplaceable. There are no more post-glacial hunters and fishers in the Scottish Highlands to contribute their ancient lineages to the global gene pool. The communities that preserved those lineages most completely have been thinned and scattered. What remains is precious, not for any mystical reason, but for the simple reason that it is rare and old and connects us to a past that we are only beginning to understand. There is one more thread to pull here, and it takes us back to the Americas, to a specific context that is worth examining in detail because it challenges the conventional narrative more directly than anything else we have discussed. In the early 20th century, a set of ancient human remains was found at a site in northeastern Brazil, in a region that archaeologists were excavating as part of a broader survey of Pleistocene sites. The remains were analyzed using craniometric techniques, measurement of skull shape and size, and the results were unexpected. The skull shape did not match the Asian-derived ancestry of most Native American populations. It was longer, narrower, with features that more closely resembled certain Paleo-Indian specimens from earlier periods in the archaeological record of the Americas, and, intriguingly, certain ancient specimens from Pacific Island populations and from early inhabitants of Australia. The individual was named Lucia, and she became the center of a fierce academic controversy about the origins of the first Americans. The standard model, the one that has dominated for decades, holds that the Americas were first populated by people from northeastern Asia who crossed the Bering Land Bridge at the end of the last ice age, roughly 15 to 20,000 years ago, and spread southward through the continents over the following millennia. Lucia's skull did not fit this model, and she was not alone. A number of other ancient skulls from the Americas, particularly from South America, show skull shapes that differ from the typical Asian-derived pattern and that some researchers have connected to populations with a different geographic origin. This has been enormously controversial. The political dimensions of the debate about Native American origins are real and significant. Any suggestion that the first Americans were not exclusively derived from Asian populations is heard, understandably, with suspicion by indigenous communities who have strong oral and cultural traditions about their own origins. The history of Western academics using bogus race science to delegitimize indigenous identity is real and relevant. But genetics is not race science. Genetics measures actual ancestry, actual biological connections, with a precision that skull shapes cannot approach. And the genetic data, when it is looked at carefully and without prejudice, tells a more complicated story than either the simple Asian-only model or the more extreme alternative theories. What the genetics clearly shows is that the great majority of Native American ancestry, across both North and South America, derives from a population that came from northeastern Asia via the Bering Land Bridge. This is not in dispute. The question is whether there are also, in specific contexts and specific populations, genetic signals that suggest additional contributions from other populations. And here the data is genuinely uncertain. There are analyses that find small but statistically significant signals of ancestry in certain Amazonian populations that resembles the ancient ancestry of peoples from Southeast Asia, Australia, and the Pacific Islands more than it resembles the northeastern Asian ancestry expected from the Bering route. These signals are small. They could be artifacts of the statistical methods used. They could reflect deep population structure within the Asian homeland before the migration, but they could also reflect a small but real contribution from a second migration by people who came by a different route. If they are real, the most likely route is across the Pacific. Not the North Atlantic, in this case, but the South Pacific, and the people involved would be related to the ancient populations of Southeast Asia and Australia rather than to the Atlantic Europeans we have been discussing. This is a different story, a Pacific story rather than an Atlantic one. But the Atlantic story has its own signal, and that signal, the evidence of Atlantic European ancestry in pre-Columbian North American contexts, is what concerns us here. It is tantalizing. It is contested. It may ultimately turn out to be a statistical artifact or a result of sample contamination. But it is real in the sense that it has been reported by multiple independent researchers working with different samples and different methodologies, and it has not been conclusively explained away by the contamination hypothesis. What would it mean if it is real? It would mean that at some point in prehistory, people from the Atlantic coast of Europe made contact with people on the Atlantic coast of North America. It would mean that the maritime culture we have been tracing, the one that built the stone circles and ranged across the North Atlantic, left a genetic trace in the Americas as well as in the Highlands of Scotland. It would mean, in short, that the story of the North Atlantic in the deep human past is far more complex and far more interesting than the conventional histories have acknowledged. That the ocean which separates Europe from America was not, for the entirety of human prehistory, an absolute barrier. That it was, at least sometimes and for at least some people, something that could be crossed. And the people who were best positioned to make those crossings, the people with the deepest maritime tradition in Atlantic Europe, the people who built and sailed skin boats in the waters of the Outer Hebrides and the Norwegian Sea, were the ancestors of the people who now live in the Western Highlands and Islands of Scotland. This is the most extreme version of the claim embedded in our title. The bloodline that is older than Britain, the lineage that connects Scotland to the deepest human past in this part of the world, may connect not just to the first inhabitants of post-glacial Europe, but to a chapter of the human story that spans the Atlantic itself. We do not know that for certain. We may never know it for certain. The evidence is there, partial and contested, and open to multiple interpretations. But the direction it points in is consistent, and the direction is the same one that the west-facing windows of Highland cottages and the west-facing entrances of Neolithic passage tombs and the west-facing stone avenues of Callanish all point. West, across the water, toward the edge of the world, and beyond it. What lies beyond it is still, in some sense, unknown. The archaeology of the North Atlantic in the pre-Norse period is still being assembled, still being contested, still capable of producing surprises. The genetics of pre-Columbian North America is still being analyzed, still being debated, still producing results that the conventional models struggle to accommodate. And in Scotland, in the stone circles and the standing stones and the symbol stones and the brocks and the ancient Atlantic harbours, the evidence of a civilization that was both older, more sophisticated than we have conventionally believed is still there, waiting to be read properly. The people are there too, in the Crannogs and the Crofts and the fishing villages, in the cities where the Highland families ended up after the clearances, in the diaspora scattered across the world. They carry the oldest continuously surviving lineage in the British Isles. They carry a genetic heritage that connects them to the first post-glacial inhabitants of Scotland, to the builders of the megalithic monuments, to the pre-Druidic astronomical tradition, to the sea-going culture that ranged across the North Atlantic. They carry all of this, not as a burden or as a privilege, but simply as a fact. An old, deep biological fact about who they are and where they come from. A fact that is only now, with the development of modern genetic science and the increasingly honest re-examination of the archaeological record, beginning to be fully understood. The Scots carry a bloodline older than Britain itself. That is the headline. But the full story, the story of what that bloodline means and where it comes from and what it connects to, that story is much longer and much stranger and much more beautiful than the headline can contain. It begins in an Ice Age refugium in southwestern Europe, with a population of hunter-gatherers surviving the coldest period on record at the edge of an icebound continent. It continues north, along an Atlantic coast that was still finding its shape, through a landscape recovering from ice and beginning to bloom. It passes through the long millennia of the Mesolithic, 15,000 years of people who knew Scotland before it was Scotland, who loved it before it had a name. It passes through the arrival of the farmers and the construction of the stone circles and the passage tombs, through the development of the astronomical and mathematical tradition that those monuments encode. It passes through the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, and the Romans and the Picts with their unreadable stones, through the Coming Heels and the Vikings and the Normans, through the Wars of Independence and the Jacobite risings and the clearances. Through all of it, the thread holds. The oldest lineages persist. The genetic record keeps its testimony, and the Atlantic stays where it always was, on the western horizon, enormous and old and patient, carrying whatever secrets it holds about what happened out there in the deep past of the North Atlantic, and whether the people of the Scottish coast were part of a story that stretched even further than anyone has yet been willing to say. That is the mystery. That is the bloodline. That is the Scotland that lies beneath the Scotland of history, older and stranger and more deeply rooted in this earth than anything the written record preserves. And it is still there, in the genes, in the stones, in the sea, waiting to be read. The Atlantic is not an ending. It never was. For the people who built Callanish and sailed the North Sea in skin boats and looked at the western horizon with the confidence of those who knew the sea better than anyone alive, the ocean was not a wall, it was a road. A dark, cold, immensely long road, but a road nonetheless. And roads, by their nature, lead somewhere. Where this one led, in the deep prehistory of the North Atlantic, is still a question, but the people who might know the answer, or at least the people whose DNA carries the most ancient traces of whoever made that journey, are still here. On the Atlantic coast of Scotland, looking west, as they have always done, as they will always do. The bloodline is older than Britain, the mystery is older than that, and the sea is oldest of all. Sleep well. Let us go back to one thing we touched on briefly and give it the space it deserves, the question of language. Because the survival of certain languages in Scotland is not merely a cultural curiosity, it is an archaeological artifact, in some ways as informative as the stone circles themselves, and its implications for understanding the depth of Scottish ancestry are profound. Scottish Gaelic is, of course, a Celtic language. It arrived in Scotland, as far as we can determine from the historical record, with the settlers of Dalriata, the Irish-Scottish kingdom that straddled the North Channel in the 5th and 6th centuries of the Common Era. It displaced, over several centuries, whatever languages were being spoken in the regions it spread into, including, presumably, Pictish, which was probably a Brittonic Celtic language, and the speech of any remnant hunter-gatherer populations that had held on in the most remote regions. But Celtic itself, the language family that encompasses Irish, Welsh, Scottish, Gaelic, Breton, and their relatives and ancestors, is not old enough to be the original language of Britain. It arrived with the Bronze Age, or possibly the Iron Age, somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 years ago, brought by people who were part of the broader Indo-European expansion from the Pontic steppe. The people who were here before the Celtic languages, the people who built the megaliths and watched the moon rise over Callanish, spoke something else, something we have no record of, because it was never written down, and because by the time anyone was writing in Britain, those older languages were already gone or going. We call this lost language, or family of languages, Old European. It is a scholarly placeholder, a way of acknowledging that we know something once existed without being able to say what it was. Traces of it survive, in place names, in the ancient names of rivers and mountains and other landscape features that were so deeply embedded in local usage that even the incoming Celtic speakers adopted them rather than replacing them. The Thames, the Severn, the Dee, the Clyde. These names are not Celtic, they are pre-Celtic. They are the last audible whispers of a language spoken by the people who were in Britain before the Celts arrived, the people whose genetic descendants are still in Scotland. River names are almost always the most conservative element of a linguistic landscape. Rivers are important and permanent. Their names get adopted by incoming populations and stick. The old names survive in river names long after everything else in the language they belong to has been forgotten. In Scotland and Ireland and Wales and the westernmost parts of England, the density of non-Celtic place names is highest where the genetic evidence for pre-Celtic ancestry is also strongest. This is not a coincidence, it is a pattern. The same populations that resisted the genetic replacement that happened more thoroughly elsewhere also resisted the complete linguistic replacement, at least partially, at least long enough to leave traces in the landscape names that subsequent speakers absorbed and passed down. The people who built Callanish did not speak Gaelic. They did not speak any form of Celtic. They spoke something older, something that has left only the faintest traces in the names of the waters around them. But they spoke it fluently and richly, and their tradition of knowledge transmission, the oral tradition that preserved astronomical and cosmological information across dozens of generations, was carried in that unknown tongue. When the Celtic languages arrived, they did not simply erase what came before. They absorbed some of it, transformed some of it, lost the rest. The mythological tradition of the Gaelic-speaking peoples, with its stories of the Tuatha De Danann and the Fomorians and the great cycles of mythological history, is a fusion product. It contains elements that are recognizably Indo-European, motifs and story types that appear in the mythologies of Greece and India and Scandinavia. But it also contains elements that are not Indo-European, that have no parallel in the mythologies of peoples who came from the steppes, elements that seem to encode knowledge and worldviews that are characteristic of Atlantic maritime cultures rather than steppe pastoral cultures. The sea is central in a way it is not in other Indo-European mythologies. The other world is frequently reached by sea, by sailing to the west, toward the setting sun. The divine beings come from across the water. The great journeys are maritime journeys. Even the underworld, in some traditions, is beneath the sea, or beneath a lake, rather than beneath the earth. These are the mythological preoccupations of a maritime people, not a steppe people. They reflect a worldview in which the sea is the primary axis of the cosmos, the boundary between this world and the next, the source of both danger and transcendence. And they have been grafted onto the framework of a Celtic language and a partly Indo-European mythological tradition in ways that reveal the complexity of the cultural synthesis that produced what we now call Gaelic culture. That synthesis is not merely Celtic. It is the product of a meeting between an incoming Celtic-speaking people from the east and a pre-existing Atlantic maritime culture from the west. The incoming people brought their language, their social structures, their particular version of the Indo-European cosmology. The pre-existing culture brought something older and in some ways more deeply rooted in the specific environment of the Atlantic fringe. The result is something neither purely Celtic nor purely pre-Celtic, but something that belongs specifically to the Atlantic edge of the world. This is why Gaelic culture, and particularly the culture of the Scottish Highlands and Islands, feels different from the Celtic cultures of Central Europe. Not just geographically, not just because of the mountains and the sea, culturally, in its relationship to time and nature, in its emphasis on the oral over the written, on memory over record, on the spoken word over the inscribed one, in its relationship with the landscape as a living entity full of presence and meaning rather than a resource to be managed. These are the characteristics of a culture that has been formed by the deep past of a specific place, not just by the more recent cultural influences that are most visible in the historical record. They are the inheritance of 15,000 years of continuous presence in a landscape, filtered through the cultural forms that Celtic language and belief provided, but not created by those forms. And they connect, as everything in this story connects, to the deepest layer of Scottish ancestry, to the people who came north along the Atlantic coast before the farming revolution, before the stone circles, before any of the cultural developments we can point to and say, this is where this tradition began. To the hunter-gatherers of the Iberian refugium who walked into Scotland before the sea rose and cut it off from the continent. Those people are the bedrock. Everything else is built on top of them. The farmers, the megalith builders, the Bronze Age arrivals, the Picts, the Gaels, the Vikings, the Normans. All of these populations contributed to what Scotland is. But the bedrock is still there, still present in the DNA, still shaping the character of the place in ways that go beyond anything that can be fully articulated. Now let us turn to something specific and concrete, something that is firmly within the historical record rather than in the deep prehistory we have been exploring, and that, nevertheless, illuminates the same pattern we have been tracing. The Declaration of Arbroath. Written in 1320 and addressed to Pope John XXIII by the nobility of Scotland in support of Robert the Bruce's claim to the Scottish throne, the Declaration of Arbroath is one of the most remarkable political documents of the medieval world. Its language is extraordinary for its time, particularly the passage that asserts the right of the Scottish people to resist and remove even their own king if he should betray their freedom. For it is not for glory, nor riches, nor honours that we are fighting, but for freedom, which no good man gives up except with his life. This sentiment, this fierce insistence on liberty as the highest political value, this willingness to extend it even against the institution of kingship itself, is not typical of medieval political writing. It anticipates, by 4 centuries and more, the ideas that would be associated with the Enlightenment and the American and French revolutions. It is, in the most literal sense, revolutionary. Where did it come from? The standard answer is that it reflected the particular political circumstances of Scotland in 1320, the experience of generations of warfare against English domination, the theological sophistication of the churchmen who drafted it, the specific influence of classical Roman political thought that was being recovered and disseminated by medieval scholars. All of these factors are real. But there is another factor that is less often discussed, one that may lie deeper than any of these historical influences. The tradition of political equality and individual dignity that is characteristic of hunter-gatherer societies. This is not a romantic projection. It is well documented in anthropological studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer groups. The social organization of hunter-gatherer bands tends to be strongly egalitarian. There are no permanent hereditary leaders. Authority is situational, based on demonstrated competence in specific domains, and can be withdrawn if it is exercised badly. Decisions are made by consensus. Individual autonomy is highly valued. Mechanisms exist for resisting and checking the overreach of would-be dominance. These are not primitive or unsophisticated social arrangements. They are adapted to the conditions of hunter-gatherer life, in which a tyrant or an incompetent leader can get people killed, and in which the small size of the group makes consensus decision-making practical. They represent a different solution to the problem of social organization than the hierarchical arrangements that typically accompany settled agriculture and urban civilization, a solution that places different values at the center of the social world. The people who were in Scotland for 15,000 years before the farming revolution were hunter-gatherers. Their social traditions, even as they were overlaid and transformed by subsequent cultural influences, may have left traces in the cultural DNA of the places where they were most concentrated, not as specific institutions or legal principles, but as underlying values, orientations toward authority and freedom and individual dignity that shaped how the later cultures of those places developed. The fierce independence that characterizes the Scottish historical tradition is not unique to Scotland. It is shared, with variations, by the Irish and the Welsh, the other peoples of the Atlantic fringe, who have the same deep genetic heritage. All 3 of these national traditions have at their core a resistance to external domination and an insistence on the value of their own distinctiveness that goes beyond what can be explained by the specific political circumstances of their histories. Could this be, at least partly, a cultural inheritance from the hunter-gatherer past, not in the sense of a direct transmission of specific beliefs or practices, but in the sense of an underlying orientation towards social life that was shaped by thousands of years of egalitarian social organization and that persisted in transformed and culturally specific forms through the subsequent layers of cultural change? This is speculative. It is the kind of speculation that professional historians are trained to be suspicious of because it involves connecting things that are very far apart in time and in the nature of the evidence. But it is not unreasonable speculation. The patterns are real. The genetic continuity is real. The question of whether cultural orientations can persist alongside genetic continuity, transmitted through the same processes of family and community socialization that transmit language and custom, is a real question, with a real if uncertain answer. And the Declaration of Arbroath is a real document, written in Latin in 1320, expressing political values that feel, somehow, as if they come from somewhere much older than the medieval church and classical political thought, as if they have roots that go deeper than the historical record reaches. Perhaps they do. Perhaps the insistence of the Scots, through all the centuries of pressure and invasion and attempted assimilation, on being what they are, on being specifically and irreducibly themselves, is not merely the result of political circumstances or cultural pride or the stubbornness that the national stereotypes attribute to them. Perhaps it is, at some level, the expression of a continuity that goes back to the beginning, to the people who were here first, who loved this place enough to stay through everything, whose genes survived everything, to the bedrock. The blood is older than Britain. The independence may be older than the blood. There is a landscape in Scotland that holds all of this more clearly than anywhere else, a landscape that is simultaneously the most ancient and the most specific, the most geological and the most human. The Outer Hebrides, the chain of islands that stretches along the northwestern edge of Scotland, separated from the mainland by the Minch, is one of the most ancient geological formations in the British Isles. The rocks of Lewis, the northernmost island of the chain, are Lewisian gneiss, among the oldest rocks in Europe, formed roughly 3 billion years ago and exposed by the grinding of the glaciers. When you stand on those rocks, you are standing on the deep structure of the planet, not the surface, the deep structure. And on those ancient rocks, the human past is equally compressed and concentrated. The Callanish standing stones, which we have already discussed, are surrounded by a landscape that is scattered with other ancient structures, chambered cairns, stone circles, ancient field systems under the peat that formed when the climate changed and the forests died and the blanket bog grew over the abandoned fields. The people who built Callanish and who farmed those ancient fields were, as we have established, the genetic inheritors of the post-glacial hunter-gatherers who came to Scotland from the Iberian refugium. And the communities that live on Lewis today, the remaining Gaelic-speaking communities of the Western Isles, carry that heritage in their DNA more completely than almost anywhere else in the British Isles. The Gaelic language is still spoken on Lewis and Harris and the Uists and Barra, not as a museum piece, not as an academic exercise, but as a living language, the language of daily life in communities that have maintained it despite centuries of pressure from English. The last stronghold of a linguistic tradition that was once spread across a much wider area of Scotland, compressed, like the deep ancestral genes themselves, into the westernmost fringe. When you hear Gaelic spoken in the Western Isles, you are hearing a language that arrived in Scotland with the Dalriata settlements in the 5th and 6th centuries. But you are hearing it spoken by people whose biological connection to this land goes back 10 times as far. The language is relatively new. The people speaking it are very old. And in that disjunction, that gap between the age of the language and the age of the biological community that speaks it, there is a kind of concentrated truth about what Scotland is and where it comes from. Scotland is not a simple thing. It is a palimpsest, a document written over and over on the same surface, each new text leaving traces of what came before. The Gaelic is the latest major writing. Beneath it are the traces of the Pictish language and the Brittonic and the pre-Celtic Old European. Beneath those are the languages of the Neolithic farmers. Beneath those is the silence of the Mesolithic, 30,000 years of spoken words that left no written trace at all. But the people who spoke those lost languages are not entirely silent. They speak in the DNA of the living population. They speak in the stones of Callanish, which encode their astronomical knowledge in a form that stone will preserve for thousands of years to come. They speak in the genetic markers that tell their story to anyone with the instruments to read it. And they speak, perhaps, in something harder to quantify but no less real, in the character of the place. In the way the Western Isles feel different from anywhere else in Britain, in the specific quality of the silence there, which is not the silence of emptiness but the silence of depth, the silence of a place that has been inhabited for a very long time and that carries the weight of all those generations in its stones and its bogs and its dark clear lochs. Anyone who has spent time in the Outer Hebrides knows what I am talking about. It is not something you can precisely describe, but it is not imaginary either. It is the feeling of deep time, of a place that has been human for a very long time, of a landscape that has absorbed generation after generation of lives and holds them somehow in the quality of its light and its silence and its relationship to the sea. That feeling is not mystical, or rather, it is mystical only in the sense that all genuine depth is mystical, the sense in which anything true and old and beyond the reach of easy explanation deserves the word. It is the accumulated presence of 15,000 years of human lives in a small and specific place, a presence that geology and genetics confirm, and that the human nervous system evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to read the social and ecological history of places can sometimes feel. The Scots carry that history in their blood, and some of them carry it in a way that is more concentrated, more continuous, more direct than almost anyone else on earth. That is worth knowing. It is worth sitting with. In the middle of the night, when the world is quiet and the questions that normally get crowded out by the noise of daily life have room to breathe. Who are we? Where do we come from? How far back does the thread go? In Scotland, the thread goes back further than almost anywhere else in the world that we have the tools to measure. It goes back to the beginning of the human story in this part of the world, and it connects, through pathways that we are only beginning to understand, to the broader story of human presence across the North Atlantic and perhaps beyond. The mystery is real, the science behind it is real, and the people at the center of it, living their lives on the Atlantic edge of Europe, are real people with a biological heritage so old and so specific that it demands a kind of respect that the conventional histories have rarely given them. The Scots did not inherit Britain. They preceded it. Their bloodline is older than the name, older than the island as it currently exists, older than any political or cultural category that has ever been applied to this part of the world. They are the original people of the North Atlantic edge, and their story is still being told. Let us return now to the place where genetics and mythology converge most directly and examine one more tradition that illuminates the depth of what we have been discussing: the Bean Seeder, the Banshee, the woman of the fairy mound. In Scottish and Irish tradition, the Banshee is a supernatural woman whose cry or wail foretells the death of a member of certain noble families. She is particularly associated with families of ancient lineage, families that can trace their descent back to the mythological peoples of the distant past. Not every family has a banshee, only those whose roots go deep enough into the old world. This is interesting, because it means that within the folk tradition itself, there is a category of human lineage that is considered so old, so continuous, so deeply connected to the pre-Christian past, that the boundaries between the human world and the other world have become permeable for them. The banshee's wail is a mark of connection. It says this family is old enough and deep enough in the roots of this place that the powers which govern those roots still have a relationship with them. From a rational, materialist perspective, the banshee is obviously a supernatural fiction, but the folk tradition that preserves the idea of the banshee is doing something real. It is marking a distinction between families with ancient continuous lineages and families that arrived more recently. It is expressing, in the language of the supernatural, a genuine distinction in the depth of biological rootedness in a place. The families that have banshees are, at least in the folk understanding, the families that are most deeply connected to the old world, the families that go back furthest. And the fact that this tradition is most strongly associated with Ireland and the Scottish Highlands, the precise regions where the oldest genetic lineages are concentrated, is not a coincidence. The folk tradition is encoding something real, even if it is encoding it in a way that looks, from the outside, like pure superstition. The sense that certain families are connected to something older and deeper than the ordinary run of history, that their roots go into a past that lies beyond the reach of written records, is a genuine perception encoded in myth and folklore across the Atlantic fringe of Europe. It corresponds with some degree of accuracy to a real genetic reality. Some families do have lineages that go further back, that are more directly connected to the pre-farming, pre-Celtic, pre-everything substrate of the population. Those families are not better or worse than families with more recent and mixed ancestry. They are not magical, they are not chosen, but they are, in a measurable and real sense, older, more continuous, more directly connected to the beginning of the human story in this part of the world. And the tradition that marks them as such, that distinguishes them from later arrivals, that attributes to them a special relationship with the powers of the old world, is a tradition that, stripped of its supernatural elements, is saying something that the genetics confirms. Some people really do carry bloodlines older than Britain, not as metaphor, not as myth, as molecular reality. The last thing I want to do before we close this long journey through the deep past of Scotland and the North Atlantic is to look at one specific archaeological site that has not received the attention it deserves, and that speaks directly to the question of how far the Atlantic maritime culture of prehistoric Europe may have reached. The site is in Orkney, not the Ring of Brodgar, which is famous enough, and not the Ness of Brodgar, the extraordinary ceremonial complex being excavated between the two main Orcadian stone circles, though that too is extraordinary in ways that archaeologists are still working out. The site I want to discuss is a boat noost. A noost is a place on a beach where a boat is kept. Essentially, a boat-shaped hollow or shelter cut into a beach bank or cliff face, designed to protect a boat from the weather when it is not in use. The tradition of noosts is ancient on the North Atlantic coast, and they have been used from the earliest period of maritime activity in these islands up to the relatively recent past. There are noosts in Orkney that are large, very large. Too large for any boat that the historical populations of Orkney are known to have used, including the Viking longships that are the largest vessels we have clear evidence for in these waters in the historical period. The existence of these large noosts suggests that at some point before the historical period, before the Norse came, there were boats in Orkney that were significantly larger than anything we have in the later record. Boats capable of carrying more people, more cargo, over longer distances. We do not know what those boats looked like. We do not know when they were built or what they were used for. The noosts are, by themselves, ambiguous evidence, but they are evidence of something, of a capacity for large-scale maritime activity in the pre-Viking Atlantic that the conventional picture of prehistoric seafaring does not fully account for. And they are in Orkney, the archipelago at the top of Scotland, the place where the Atlantic meets the North Sea, the natural waypoint on any northern route between the British Isles and Iceland and Greenland, and eventually the coasts of North America, the place where the people who built the Ring of Brodgar and Skara Brae and the extraordinary complex at the Ness of Brodgar lived for thousands of years, developing their astronomical traditions and their maritime skills in the most demanding and challenging maritime environment in the world. The North Atlantic in a storm is not a place for the timid or the inexperienced. The people who lived in Orkney for thousands of years were neither timid nor inexperienced. They were the world's best sailors, operating in the world's most challenging waters, with generations of accumulated knowledge about how to survive there, and, when conditions allowed, how to range further than survival alone would require. Further north, further west, toward the edge of the known world and beyond it. We do not know how far they went, but we know they were capable of going very far indeed. And we know that the people most directly descended from them, the people who carry the oldest and most continuous Atlantic fringe genetics in the British Isles, are still in Scotland, still on the coasts, still looking west. The bloodline is older than Britain. The sea is its oldest road, and where that road led, in the deep and mostly silent past of the North Atlantic, is one of the great remaining mysteries of human prehistory, a mystery that belongs, more than to anyone else, to the people who carry that road in their blood. They are still here, in the genetics, in the stones, in the sea wind and the salt air, and the specific quality of light on the Hebridean water in the hour before sunset, when everything goes still and the colours deepen, and for a moment, if you are paying attention, you can feel the presence of a very long past pressing close. This is Scotland, not the Scotland of history books, not the Scotland of Highland games and whiskey distilleries and the tourist industry's careful packaging of the picturesque and the romantic, the real Scotland, the old Scotland, the Scotland that was here before it was Scotland, that will be here long after whatever we call it next. The bloodline of that Scotland runs unbroken from the first post-glacial footstep on the tundra to the present moment. It is the oldest continuously surviving genetic heritage in the British Isles. It connects the living people of the Western Highlands and Islands to a world so old that we do not have names for it, a world of ice and sea and the slow greening of a thawing continent. It is older than Britain. It is older than the concept of Britain. It is older than almost anything in European history that we can put a name on. And it is still here, alive, breathing, passed from parent to child in the oldest and most fundamental act of biological continuity, the same act by which every species continues itself, generation after generation, through every catastrophe and every change. The blood continues, the mystery continues, and the sea, which carried those first ancestors north from the edge of a melting glacier, which held the boats of the megalith builders, which received the prayers of the Druids, and witnessed the coronations of the Pictish kings, and endured the clearances, and watched the diaspora sail away. The sea goes on. West, always west, into the mystery. And perhaps, far on the other side of the mystery, into a story we have not yet found the courage to fully tell. Sleep on that. It is worth dreaming about. The oldest blood in Britain is the blood that was always here, in the stones and the sea, and the long, long memory of the Atlantic fringe. And it is in the people who have carried it, unknowing, from the very beginning. The Scots, before Britain, before history, before memory, simply here, as they have always been. There is a question that underlies everything we have been discussing, a question that historians rarely ask because it falls outside the conventional boundaries of their discipline, but that is genuinely important if we want to understand why the Scottish genetic story matters beyond the borders of one small northern country. The question is this: what does it mean for human history as a whole when a population maintains biological continuity with the very first inhabitants of a place over a span of 15,000 years? This is not a trivial question. In most parts of the world that have been continuously inhabited for that long, the original populations have been genetically replaced many times over. The replacement was not always violent, though it sometimes was. More often, it was the slow demographic pressure of incoming populations with advantages in food production or technology or disease resistance, advantages that allowed them to grow faster and eventually absorb or marginalize whatever was there before them. The fact that this did not happen completely in the Scottish Highlands and Islands, that the bedrock population persisted through farming revolution and Bronze Age and Iron Age and all the subsequent waves of migration and conquest, tells us something important about the nature of that persistence. It happened partly because of geography. Scotland's western fringe, with its endless complexity of islands and sea locks and mountain barriers, is a landscape that naturally favours small, resourceful, locally adapted populations over larger, more mobile incoming ones. The terrain penalizes the advantages of sheer numbers and rewards the advantages of specific local knowledge. People who know exactly which currents to use to navigate between the islands, exactly where the safe anchorages are in a storm, exactly which plants provide what medicines in this specific climate, have an enormous practical advantage over newcomers who do not. This is the geography of resilience. The Atlantic fringe of Europe is a landscape that consistently protected remnant populations through the great demographic upheavals of prehistory, not because it was impregnable, but because it was difficult enough to make the cost of full replacement too high to bear. The incoming populations could come, they could settle, they could intermarry, but they could not simply erase what was there before them, because what was there before them was too well adapted, too deeply embedded, too thoroughly integrated into the specific ecology of the place, to be displaced without a struggle that was not worth the cost. This is why the Atlantic fringe consistently shows the highest frequencies of the oldest European genetic lineages. This is why the Basque Country and Wales and the west of Ireland and the Scottish Highlands are the refugia, in the modern genetic landscape, of the pre-farming European hunter-gatherer ancestry. Not because those populations were braver or more tenacious than others, though they may have been, but because the landscape they lived in gave them advantages in the competition for biological survival that the more accessible and easily farmed regions of Central Europe did not provide. The mountains and the sea. These are the protectors of old lineages, the barriers that preserve ancient diversity, the places where the deep past survives most completely. And of all the mountainous and sea-girt refugia of Atlantic Europe, Scotland may be the most spectacular example. The combination of the Highland Mountains and the Hebridean archipelago and the northern remoteness of Orkney and Shetland created a series of nested refugia that offered protection at multiple scales. Small communities in remote glens could survive population pressures that would have swept away communities in more accessible places. Island communities could maintain independence that mainland communities could not. The result, over 15,000 years, is a genetic legacy that is both ancient and remarkably diverse. Not diverse in the sense of containing many different recently arrived elements, though Scotland certainly does contain those, but diverse in the sense of having maintained many different ancient lineages that were lost elsewhere in Europe. Multiple, distinct, deep ancestry threads, each preserved in a different corner of a complex and varied landscape. When modern geneticists map the genetic diversity of Scotland, they find a patchwork of different ancestral proportions that correlates, broadly, with the geography of the country. The populations of the Western Isles and the Northwest Highlands show the strongest signal of the ancient Atlantic coast ancestry. The populations of the East and Northeast show stronger signals of the later Bronze Age and Iron Age arrivals. The populations of the Central Belt and the borders show the most complex mixing, reflecting the history of that region as a zone of contact and interaction. This geographic pattern is not random. It is the genetic fingerprint of 15,000 years of history, encoded in the distribution of human ancestry across a specific landscape. Read properly, it tells the story of every major migration and every great demographic upheaval of the prehistoric period, preserved in living people. The Scots are a living archive, not just of their own past, but of the human past in this part of the world. They carry in their cells a record of the deep history of the North Atlantic that no library contains, that no monument encodes as completely, that no tradition preserves as continuously. That record is only now being read. The science of ancient and modern population genetics is young. The computational tools that allow researchers to extract and compare genetic information at the resolution needed to trace lineages across tens of thousands of years have only been developed in the last decade or two. We are in the early stages of what will be a long process of understanding what the genetic record of Scotland tells us about the deep human past. And the story it is telling, as those early results come in, is consistently more complex and more interesting and more challenging to the conventional models than anyone quite expected. The bedrock ancestry is older than the models predicted. The continuity is stronger than the models assumed. The connections to the broader Atlantic maritime culture are more persistent and more significant than the models acknowledged. Something happened in Scotland, and in the Atlantic fringe of Europe more broadly, that did not happen in the same way anywhere else. A genetic and cultural continuity that spans the full breadth of the post-glacial period, from the first footsteps on the tundra to the present day, preserved against all the demographic odds by the specific geography of the Atlantic edge. That continuity is a gift, not to Scotland alone, though Scots carry it most directly, to everyone who wants to understand the deep human past. Because the people who preserve that old ancestry, who carry those ancient lineages in their DNA, are a kind of living connection to a world that is otherwise silent. They are the last people who remember, in their blood, if not in their conscious minds, what it was like to be here before any of this was history, before any of it had a name, before Britain, before history, before memory, in the ordinary sense, but not before people. People were here, and their blood has never left. There is another dimension to this story that we have not yet explored fully, one that connects the genetic deep past to the very specific and concrete experience of being Scottish in the present day. The experience of belonging to a place that is older than you can comprehend. Every person who has grown up in the Scottish Highlands or the Western Isles knows, on some level, what this feels like. Not as a historical fact that they learned from a textbook, but as something they absorbed from the landscape itself. The feeling that this place is not just where you happen to have been born, but where you come from in some much deeper and more irreducible sense. The feeling that the rocks and the sea and the weather are not just your environment, but your inheritance. Something that was given to you by people who came before you, stretching back further than you can trace. This is not nostalgia. Nostalgia is longing for a past you actually remember, or at least can imagine remembering. What Highlanders feel about their landscape is something deeper than nostalgia, something closer to what biologists call biophilia, the innate human tendency to feel connection to natural systems, but concentrated and intensified by thousands of years of continuous presence in a specific place. The Gaelic tradition has many words for this kind of place attachment that English does not have equivalents for. Dúthchas is the most important one. It means something like hereditary land claim, but that translation misses the depth of the concept. Dúthchas is not merely a legal or political claim to land. It is a claim that runs through the biological relationship between a family and a specific place. It says these people and this land belong to each other in a way that goes beyond ownership, beyond politics, beyond law. They are connected by ancestry, In the world of medieval and early modern Gaelic society, Dúthchas was a real and recognized social concept, one that formed the basis of the clan system's relationship to territory. The chief did not own the land in the feudal European sense. The chief and the clan were the land, in a sense, because they were the people whose ancestors had been part of this place for as long as anyone could remember, and whose continued presence on the land was what gave it meaning and identity. This concept, Dúthchas, is not merely a medieval social construct. It encodes something real about the relationship between a genetically continuous population and the landscape they have inhabited for generations. It is the social and legal expression of a biological fact. A fact that, as we have seen, is demonstrably true in the case of the Scottish Highland population, whose genetic continuity with the ancient inhabitants of their landscape is one of the most remarkable in the world. When the clearances destroyed the clan system and scattered the people of Dúthchas across the globe, they were not merely dismantling a social arrangement. They were severing one of the deepest biological cultural connections between a people and a place that existed anywhere in Europe, a connection that had been maintained through farming revolution and Bronze Age and Iron Age and Christian conversion and Norse raids and Norman influence and centuries of political pressure for 15,000 unbroken years. The severing of that connection is one of the great tragedies of Scottish history. But it is not irreversible, at least not in the genetic sense. The people who were cleared, and their descendants, still carry Dúthchas in their DNA. They carry it wherever they went, to Nova Scotia and Ontario and New Zealand and Patagonia and every other corner of the world where the Scots dispersed. They carry the oldest lineages in the British Isles, encoded in their cells, a biological connection to a specific landscape on the Atlantic edge of Europe that cannot be cleared away. And some of them are coming back. The genetic diaspora is not entirely lost. Some descendants of cleared families have returned to Scotland, bringing with them those ancient lineages from the far corners of the earth, reintroducing to the landscape the biological connection that the clearances tried to break. It is not the same as an uninterrupted Dúthchas, but it is a continuation of something, a resumption, a return. The thread is not broken, only stretched. Let us look now at one more specific element of the archaeological record that speaks directly to the question of prehistoric maritime activity in the Scottish North Atlantic and that has received far less attention than it deserves. The evidence for seagoing vessels in the Mesolithic and Neolithic periods of Scotland comes from several indirect sources. There is the simple fact of island colonization. The Outer Hebrides, Orkney, and Shetland were all inhabited in the Mesolithic period, long before the farming revolution, by hunter-gatherer communities that must have crossed significant stretches of open sea to get there. The Minch, which separates the Outer Hebrides from the mainland, is roughly 50 kilometers at its narrowest point. It is not a gentle stretch of water. Even on calm days, the currents are powerful, and the swells can be significant. In bad weather, it is one of the most dangerous bodies of water in the world. People were crossing it in small boats, presumably similar to the skin-framed curraghs of later tradition at least 8,000 years ago. We know this because there are Mesolithic sites in the Outer Hebrides, stone tools and food remains that confirm human habitation in a period when the only way to get there was by sea. This is not trivial. This tells us that the people of the Scottish Mesolithic were capable open-water sailors, not just coastal paddlers, not just people who cautiously hopped between islands that were close together, but people who could look across 50 kilometers of open Atlantic Sea and decide to cross it and succeed. And if they could cross the Minch, what else could they cross? The distance from the Outer Hebrides to Iceland is roughly 1,000 kilometers. That is 20 times the Minch crossing. But it is not qualitatively different. It is the same kind of navigation, with the same kind of vessels, in the same kind of sea, longer, more dangerous, requiring more preparation and more knowledge and more courage, but not fundamentally different in kind from what those Mesolithic sailors were already doing in the waters around Scotland. And the distance from Iceland to Greenland is about 300 kilometers, and the distance from Greenland to the northeastern coast of North America via Baffin Island and Labrador is similar. Each hop is manageable. The whole route, island by island, stepping stone by stepping stone across the North Atlantic, is theoretically navigable by anyone capable of the Minch crossing. The Norse did it. That is historically established. But did anyone do it before the Norse? The evidence suggests it is at least possible that someone did. The Norse sagas themselves tell of people they called Skraelings, native inhabitants of the North American coasts they reached, and of people they called white men, or Fitramanaland, who they encountered in the Western Atlantic, and who appeared to have some connection to European culture. These references are brief and ambiguous and do not constitute proof of anything, but they are suggestive. And the noosts in Orkney, those boat shelters too large for any historically documented vessel in these waters, suggest a maritime capacity in the pre-Norse period that we have not fully accounted for. Whatever boats occupied those noosts were larger than curraghs. They were something in between the skin frame technology of the earliest Atlantic maritime tradition and the fully developed clinker-built longships of the Norse. Something we do not have a clear archaeological record for, presumably because the materials they were made of have not survived. The absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. It is the evidence of perishable materials and the passage of time. The skin, boats, and wooden boats of prehistory are gone. The stone structures they left behind, the noosts, remain. And those remaining structures tell us that something was happening in the North Atlantic before the Norse that our conventional models have not captured. This is not a small thing. The conventional model of the first permanent human contact between Europe and the Americas attributes it to the Norse around the year 1000 CE. But permanent contact is not the same as all contact. The Norse established a settlement at Lansa or Meadows that lasted for a few decades. But they also had a context of knowledge about the Western Atlantic that preceded their settlement voyages, knowledge accumulated over generations of sailing those waters. Where did that knowledge come from? Some of it, certainly, from their own exploration. But some of it may have been older, inherited from the Atlantic maritime tradition that preceded them in these waters. The people who lived in Orkney before the Norse arrived were not maritime novices. They were the inheritors of the longest continuous maritime tradition in Northern Europe, a tradition that went back to the Mesolithic, to the first people who crossed the Minch in skin boats 8,000 years ago. The Norse did not bring maritime culture to Orkney. They found it there. What did the pre-Norse Orcadians know about the Western Ocean? We cannot say. We have no written record, no surviving tradition. But the question is worth asking, and the answer, if we ever find it, may change our understanding of the deep human history of the North Atlantic more fundamentally than anything the Norse sagas have given us. There is one last thing I want to say about the Scottish genetic heritage before we close, and it concerns the future rather than the past. We are living in the early years of the genetic revolution. The tools that allow us to read ancient and modern DNA with the precision needed to trace lineages across tens of thousands of years are new. The databases that allow us to compare those lineages across populations and time periods are still being built. The analytical methods that let researchers identify subtle genetic signals of ancient admixture and ancient migration are still being refined. In the coming decades, those tools will improve dramatically. The cost of whole genome sequencing will fall to the point where it becomes routine, where anyone who wants to know their full genetic heritage can access that information easily. The databases of ancient DNA from archaeological sites will expand to cover regions and time periods that are currently blank spots in our understanding. The analytical methods will become sophisticated enough to detect signals that are currently too faint to read. When that happens, the story of Scottish genetic heritage will be told with a clarity and a completeness that is not currently possible. The deep lineages will be traced with greater precision. The connections to the broader Atlantic maritime culture will be quantified. The question of any transatlantic contact in the pre-Norse period will be resolved, one way or another, by evidence that is currently just beyond the resolution of our instruments. That is an extraordinary prospect. Within the lifetimes of many people alive today, we may have definitive answers to questions that have been speculative for generations. We may know, with real confidence, how deep the continuity of the Scottish Atlantic population actually goes. We may know whether any of that population's ancestral lineages made it to the other side of the Atlantic before Columbus and before the Norse. We may know, in molecular detail, what the Pictish symbol stones were saying and why certain lineages persisted in certain parts of Scotland with such remarkable tenacity. And when we know those things, the story we tell about Scotland, about its history and its identity and its place in the broader human narrative, will be different from the story we tell now. Not in the superficial elements, not in the battles and the kings and the poetry and the whiskey, but in the deep structure, in the understanding of what Scotland actually is and has always been. The oldest, continuous genetic heritage in the British Isles, the remnant of an Atlantic maritime civilization of extraordinary sophistication, the living connection to a time before Britain, before history, before memory in the ordinary sense, the bloodline that is older than the name of the land it inhabits. That is what the genetics says. That is what the archaeology suggests. That is what the mythology, at its deepest layers, reaches toward. And the people who carry it, the living people of Scotland, particularly of the Western Highlands and Islands where the ancient lineages are most concentrated, deserve to know it. Deserve to understand that what they carry in their blood is not merely one more recent strand in the complex tapestry of European genetic history. It is the oldest thread, the one that was here first and has never left, the one that connects the present to the beginning in a chain of descent so long and so unbroken that it defies the conventional categories of historical understanding. The Scots carry a bloodline older than Britain itself. That is the headline. But the full meaning of that fact is something that takes a long time to absorb, longer than a single night's listening. It is the kind of knowledge that has to settle into you slowly, like the fog that comes in off the Atlantic and fills the glens and the sea locks of the Highlands, unhurried and thorough and ancient beyond reckoning. Let it settle. Let it fill the quiet. Let it carry you towards sleep and toward whatever dreams come from understanding, even dimly, how deep the past runs and how far the thread of human presence in this strange, old, beautiful, Atlantic-facing corner of the world actually goes. The stones are still standing. The sea is still there. The blood is still running. And somewhere in the Western Isles, in the last hour before dawn, a person whose ancestors stood on this coast 15,000 years ago is listening to the water and feeling, without quite knowing why, that they have always been here. They have. They always have. Good night. There is a name that keeps appearing when you trace the oldest layers of Atlantic European prehistory. A name, or rather a cluster of related names, that archaeologists and geneticists use to refer to the people who were responsible for the megalithic tradition, who built the passage tombs and the stone circles and the long barrows, who aligned massive stones to the movements of celestial bodies with precision that challenges us today. The scholars call them the Western Hunter-Gatherer-Farmer Complex, or the Atlantic Megalithic people, or various other technical designations that capture their genetic and cultural characteristics without quite capturing who they were. Let us try for a moment to actually imagine who they were. Not the abstract genetic constructs of population genetics, not the archaeological artifacts of lithics and pottery and faunal remains, but the actual human beings who lived these lives and made these monuments and understood these things. Imagine a community of perhaps 50 people, living on the coast of what would one day be called Lewis, in what would one day be the Outer Hebrides. The time is approximately 3,000 years before the Common Era, which means 5,000 years before the present day. The Callanish stones have not yet been built, or are in the process of being built, or have been standing for a generation or two. The date matters less than the character of the life. These 50 people live in a landscape that is both harsh and generous. Harsh because the Atlantic winters are ferocious, because the ground is thin and rocky and difficult to farm, because the sea can turn murderous without warning. Generous because the sea itself provides an extraordinary abundance of food, fish and shellfish and seabirds, and occasionally stranded whales, and because the land, while not easy to farm in the continental sense, supports cattle and sheep and pigs, and grows barley when the summer is kind. These people know this landscape in the way we have discussed, with the knowledge of generations. They know where the seals haul out in spring. They know which fishing grounds give the best catches at which tides and in which seasons. They know which plants grow where and what they are good for. They know the weather in the way that people who have no shelter from the weather come to know it, with a precision and a range of perception that extends well beyond what most of us can access. And they know the sky. This is the thing that distinguishes their community from most of the farming communities of their time across Europe. Not unique, but concentrated here on the Atlantic fringe in a way that reflects a tradition of astronomical observation that goes back not just to their own generation, but to the generations of their grandparents and their great-grandparents, back through the farming period to the hunter-gatherers who preceded the farmers in this place, back to the very beginnings of the human presence in these islands. The knowledge of the sky that this community possesses is not the casual knowledge of people who look up occasionally and note the phases of the moon or the progression of the seasons. It is the systematic, precise, long-term observational knowledge of people for whom the movements of the celestial bodies are the fundamental calendar, the organizing principle of all agricultural and ritual and social activity, the text on which the meaning of time and the ordering of life is written. They know that the moon has a major standstill cycle of 18.5 years, during which its southern extreme rises and sets over very specific points on the horizon. They know this because they have been observing it for many generations, because they have built structures aligned to those extreme positions, so that the alignment can be checked and confirmed without the need to recalculate from scratch each cycle. They have, in other words, built instruments. Instruments made of stone, scaled to the landscape, aligned to celestial phenomena, preserved against the possibility that the living practitioners of the tradition might die or disperse before the knowledge can be passed on. The Callanish stones are, among other things, a backup copy of the astronomical knowledge of the Atlantic megalithic tradition, a version of that knowledge that does not depend on the survival of any particular individual or community, because it is encoded in the physical orientation of massive standing stones in a landscape that changes on geological rather than human timescales. This is extraordinary. It is the kind of long-term thinking, the concern for preserving knowledge across generations that could span catastrophes that we do not usually attribute to pre-literate peoples. But the evidence that it is what the megalithic builders were doing is in the stones themselves, in the precision of their alignments, in the scale of the structures they built, in the evident concern for permanence that led them to use the largest and heaviest and most durable materials available. These were not simple people. These were people who understood time on a scale that most modern humans never attempt to think about. They were building for the long run, for the people who would come after them, generations removed, who might need the knowledge encoded in the stones even if the tradition of living practice had been interrupted. They succeeded. The stones are still there. The alignments are still verifiable. The knowledge is still encoded in the landscape, waiting for the people who come to look at it with the right questions. And the descendants of those people, carrying in their DNA the genetic signature of the builders, are still in Scotland. Not because of any mystical connection, not because of any special destiny, but simply because the processes of biological inheritance and geographical continuity that we have been tracing throughout this story produced this outcome. The people who built these things had children. Those children had children. The lineages persisted. The genes survived. And the genes carry something, not the knowledge itself, obviously. Genes do not encode specific cultural information in any direct way, but they carry the biological substrate on which that knowledge was built. The same brains, the same sensory systems, the same cognitive capacities that allowed the builders to construct Callanish with the precision they achieved. Those capacities are biological. They are, at some level, heritable. The people who live in the Outer Hebrides today do not consciously carry the astronomical knowledge of the Callanish builders. That knowledge was lost, or more precisely, was not successfully transmitted through all the subsequent generations of cultural change. But they carry the biological capacity for that kind of knowledge. The same precision, the same patience, the same ability to observe and record and think across long timescales that their ancestors applied to the movements of the moon. It shows up in different forms in different contexts. In the fisherman who can read the weather in ways that instruments cannot match. In the crofter who knows exactly when to cut the hay and when to leave it. In the musician who can hold a melody that has been passed down for hundreds of years with perfect fidelity. In the storyteller who can recite genealogies extending back dozens of generations from memory. The capacity is there. It has always been there. It is one of the things that the bloodline carries. There is something that needs to be said about the Norse, because the Norse are sometimes presented as the people who brought maritime civilization to Scotland, as if the Atlantic Sea tradition began with the Viking raids of the 8th century, and everything before was merely local and limited. This is exactly backwards. When the Norse arrived in Orkney and Shetland and the Hebrides, in the 8th and 9th centuries, they did not find an empty sea. They found communities of people who had been sailing these waters for thousands of years before the first Norse keel cut the Minch. The people they found were the inheritors of the Atlantic megalithic tradition, the descendants of the megalithic builders, the people who built the Ring of Brodgar and Callanish and the extraordinary complex at the Ness of Brodgar. Those people were not maritime novices. They were among the most experienced mariners in the world, people whose knowledge of the North Atlantic had been accumulating for thousands of years, people who knew the currents and the tides and the weather patterns of those waters with an intimacy that the Norse could not match when they first arrived. What happened when the Norse came was not the introduction of maritime culture to a backward people. It was the collision of two sophisticated maritime traditions. The Norse tradition, based on the clinker-built longship and the warrior culture of the Scandinavian Iron Age, the Atlantic tradition, based on the skin-framed currach and thousands of years of accumulated knowledge of the North Atlantic. The result of that collision was complex. There was violence. There was also trade, intermarriage, cultural exchange. The Norse settled in Orkney and Shetland and the Hebrides, and over generations became part of the Atlantic population, their genes mixing with the existing population, their culture blending with what was already there. The result was something neither purely Norse nor purely Atlantic, but a synthesis, the Norse Gaelic culture of the western seaboard, from which much of what we think of as distinctively Scottish Highland culture derives. But the substrate on which that synthesis was built was the Atlantic tradition, the culture and knowledge and genetic heritage that was already there when the Norse arrived. And that substrate was not destroyed by the Norse arrival. It persisted, absorbed the Norse elements, and continued. Just as it had absorbed the Bronze Age arrivals, the Iron Age arrivals, the Romans, the Gaels, just as it had absorbed every wave of incoming population and culture, and yet maintained, in the genetic and cultural bedrock, something continuous and something very old. This is the pattern we have been tracing throughout this story. The Atlantic fringe as the preserver of old things, the place where ancient lineages survive. The place where the deep past persists not as a museum artifact but as a living reality, in the DNA of living people. The Norse connection actually gives us one more data point in the question of pre-Columbian transatlantic contact. The Norse reached North America, via Iceland and Greenland, around the year 1000 CE. They encountered native peoples. They established a settlement that lasted for a few decades. The contact was real but limited. But before that settlement, there were the legends. The Norse saga tradition speaks of lands to the west in terms that suggest knowledge that predates the settlement voyages of Leif Erikson. Eirik the Red knew about the western lands before he formally explored them, because others before him had been blown there or had glimpsed them from a distance or had heard reports from people who had. Where did those pre-settlement reports come from? Some may have been from Norse sailors who had been pushed west by storms. Some may have been from Irish monks, who the Norse sagas explicitly mention as prior inhabitants of Iceland and Greenland, and some, just possibly, may have come from the Atlantic maritime tradition that preceded the Norse in these waters. The tradition whose practitioners had been sailing the North Atlantic, following the stepping stones of the Faroe Islands and Iceland and Greenland for thousands of years before the Norse arrival. If the Atlantic megalithic people had knowledge of lands to the west, that knowledge would not have been lost overnight when the farming cultures and the Bronze Age and the Iron Age arrived. Knowledge, especially navigational knowledge, encoded in practical tradition, is remarkably persistent. It survives in modified forms. It gets absorbed into new frameworks. It shows up, centuries or millennia later, in unexpected places. The Irish monks who inhabited Iceland before the Norse, who are mentioned in the sagas as having already been there when the Norse arrived, were the inheritors of the Atlantic tradition in its Christian form. The tradition of remarkable long-distance sea voyaging in currachs that produced the legendary voyage of St. Brendan, the tradition of monasticism on remote Atlantic islands like Skellig Michael off the coast of Kerry, the tradition of a spiritual geography that located the other world to the west over the ocean. These are the Christian-era expressions of a much older Atlantic worldview. And the people who maintained that worldview, who sailed those waters in their skin boats and their small wooden vessels, were the people whose genetic legacy is most concentrated in the Western Highlands and Islands of Scotland. The people who carry the oldest bloodline in Britain. The chain of connection is long. It stretches from the post-glacial hunter-gatherers who first walked into Scotland, to the Mesolithic fishermen who crossed the Minch in skin boats, to the Neolithic builders of Callanish and Brodgar, to the Pictish communities of the Iron Age, to the Gaelic-speaking peoples of the medieval period, to the Norse Gaelic synthesis of the western seaboard, to the communities that were cleared in the 18th and 19th centuries, to the diaspora that is scattered across the world today. Long, but unbroken. Each generation received something from the one before and passed something to the one after. Not the same thing, never unchanged, always in different forms, but connected. A continuity, not of culture in the simple sense, but of life itself, of the biological fact of being human in a specific place, over an immense span of time. The blood is older than Britain. The continuity is real. The connection to the deep past is not metaphor but molecular reality. And that reality, in the end, is one of the most remarkable facts about the human presence in the British Isles, that in one corner of one small northern island, a genetic thread has persisted from the very beginning of human habitation in this land to the present day, that the people who first walked into post-glacial Scotland have biological descendants living in Scotland today, that the chain of life, across 15,000 years, has never been broken. The stones of Callanish will stand for another 5,000 years at least. The genes of the people who built them are already 10,000 years older than the stones. Both will outlast any history we might write about them. And that, perhaps, is the most important thing this story has to say. Not about Scotland specifically, not about genetics or archaeology or the North Atlantic maritime tradition, but about the nature of human continuity itself, about how far back the thread actually goes, about how unbroken it actually is. We think of ancient history as something separate from us, something that happened to other people in other times, and that we can only access through books and museums and archaeological sites. But the genetic record tells us something different. It tells us that the past is not separate from us, it is in us, literally, molecularly. The people who built Callanish are not ancient history. They are our biology. Their lives are in our cells. For the people of Scotland, and particularly for the people of the Western Highlands and Islands, this is especially true. The thread goes back further and more continuously than almost anywhere else. The biological connection to the deepest human past in this part of the world is not an abstraction. It is a fact about every person whose ancestry traces to those Atlantic communities. The bloodline is older than Britain. It is older than the idea of Britain. It is older than almost anything we have a name for. And it is alive. In the people. In the stones. In the sea. In the long, slow, patient continuity of life, in a hard and beautiful place at the edge of the world. Sleep now. Let the old blood carry you. Let the ancient Atlantic hum in the back of your mind as you drift toward wherever sleep takes you. The thread holds. It has always held. It always will. We should talk about what happens when a civilization disappears, but its knowledge does not. This is rarer than you might think. Usually, when a civilization ends, its knowledge ends with it. The records are lost, the practitioners die, the traditions are broken. The library at Alexandria burning is the most famous example, but there are others, countless others. Most of what the ancient world knew and thought and believed is gone, simply because the systems that preserved it were destroyed before they could pass it on. But occasionally, the knowledge does not end. It persists in forms that are harder to destroy than libraries and harder to burn than scrolls. It persists in living practice, in the hands of craftspeople and navigators and healers who know what they know through use and repetition rather than through reading. It persists in landscape, in the alignments of monuments and the names of places and the routes of ancient trackways. It persists in the oral tradition, in stories that carry information in their structure even when the people telling them no longer understand what information the structure is encoding. And it persists in the DNA. Not the knowledge itself, because knowledge is not genetic, but the capacity for the knowledge. The cognitive and sensory and social capacities that allowed the knowledge to be developed in the first place, those persist because they are biological, because they are encoded in the genome of the people who carry the lineages that developed them. The astronomical tradition of the Atlantic megalithic people is a case in point. The specific knowledge, The exact calculations that allowed the builders to align Callanish and Newgrange and the Ring of Brodgar with such precision that knowledge did not survive in transmissible form. We cannot read it from any text, because there is no text. We can only infer parts of it from the structures themselves, by working backward from the alignments to the understanding they imply. But the capacity for that kind of knowledge did survive. It survived in the people who built the structures and in their biological descendants. And it shows up in the communities that preserve the highest concentrations of that ancient ancestry in exactly the forms you would expect, in a highly developed spatial and navigational intelligence, in a very precise attunement to weather and natural cycles, in the storytelling tradition that preserves information across generations with remarkable fidelity, in the musical tradition that requires the holding and transmission of complex melodic and rhythmic patterns across long time spans. These are the same cognitive capacities, in different modern expressions, that built Callanish. The same precision, the same patience, the same capacity for long-term information management that the megalithic builders applied to the movements of the moon, applied by their biological descendants to fishing and farming and music and story. The knowledge changed its form, the capacity did not. This is what it means, at the deepest level, to carry a bloodline, not a specific set of beliefs or memories or practices, but the biological substrate from which those things arose. The same brain, the same sensory organs, the same social instincts that built one of the great astronomical monuments of prehistoric Europe, still present in the people of the Scottish coast, expressing themselves in the forms available to them in the 21st century. And that substrate is not inert. It is not a museum piece. It is alive and active, expressing itself every day in the lives of people who have no idea, in most cases, that they carry it. People who are not consciously aware of being the biological inheritors of an ancient astronomical tradition, but who navigate the world with a precision and a sensitivity to natural patterns that reflects, however distantly and however transformed, the same capacities that their ancestors applied to very different problems. This is not mysticism, it is biology, and it is one of the most remarkable things about the human species, the way that the deep past persists in us not as memory but as capacity. The way that what our ancestors were shapes, in biological ways that we are only beginning to understand what we can be. The Scots, and particularly the Scots of the Atlantic fringe, carry in their biology a capacity that was developed over 15,000 years of continuous presence in one of the most demanding environments on Earth. That capacity is not a guarantee of anything. It is not a destiny. It is a possibility. A set of tools, forged over an enormous span of time, available to the people who carry them. What they do with those tools is up to them, as it has always been up to each generation of people in this place, from the first hunter-gatherers who crossed the Minch to the people who are alive there tonight. The tools are old, the choices are new, the story is still being written. There is one more mystery I want to leave you with, because it connects everything we have discussed to a question that is both very old and very current. The question of consciousness, of what it means to be aware, to have inner experience, to be the kind of being that looks at the stars and asks why and builds monuments to preserve the answer. When did that begin? Not the biological capacity for consciousness, which presumably goes very far back into our evolutionary history, but the specifically human form of it, the self-reflective, time-binding, story-making, meaning-seeking consciousness that characterizes our species, and that has produced everything from cave paintings to cathedrals to symphonies to spacecraft. The conventional answer is that it began, or at least became fully developed, somewhere around 50 to 70,000 years ago, in the period that archaeologists call the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, the period when art and symbolic behavior and long-distance exchange of materials and other markers of complex cognition suddenly appear in the archaeological record in multiple places simultaneously. But the oldest astronomical monuments in Scotland, the traditions of skywatching that produced Callanish, go back only to 5,000 years ago or so. Why is there a gap of 45,000 years between the emergence of modern human cognition and the building of the megalithic monuments? The answer, almost certainly, is that the gap is not what it appears. The kind of systematic, long-term astronomical observation that the monuments encode did not begin with the monuments. It began long before, in the practices of people who observed the sky and noted the patterns and passed the knowledge down through generations of oral tradition for thousands of years before anyone thought to encode that knowledge in stone. The monuments are not the beginning of the tradition. They are the expression of a tradition that was already ancient when the first stone was placed. The decision to build Callanish, to create a permanent physical record of the astronomical knowledge that the community possessed, was made by people who inherited that knowledge from many generations before them. The tradition of skywatching was old. The monument was the relatively recent decision to make it permanent. This matters because it means the kind of consciousness we are talking about, the capacity to track celestial cycles across lifetimes and generations, and to encode that tracking in cultural practice that survives catastrophic change, is not 5,000 years old. It is at least as old as the modern human presence in the Atlantic fringe, which means it is at least 15,000 years old in Scotland, and considerably older in the populations that came to Scotland from the Iberian refugium. The people who first walked into post-glacial Scotland were already, in terms of their cognitive capacities, fully modern humans. They had language, they had social complexity, they had the ability to track time and plan for the future and learn from the past. They had art. The cave paintings of the Iberian refugium, from which those people came, are among the most extraordinary examples of Paleolithic art anywhere in the world. The horses and bisons and hands at Altamira and Lascaux were painted by the ancestors of the people who walked into Scotland after the ice. Those ancestors brought with them not just their genes but their tradition, their practices, their ways of looking at the world, their particular form of the human capacity for wonder and meaning-making, and the desire to leave something permanent in a world of constant change. And that tradition, carried north along the Atlantic coast, adapted to the specific conditions of the Scottish environment, refined over 15,000 years of continuous practice, produced Callanish. The tradition is older than Callanish. The blood is older than Britain. The consciousness that did all of this, the specifically human awareness that looks at the world and asks questions and makes meaning, that is older than all of it. It is as old as we are, as old as the species, as old as the capacity for wonder. And it is still there, in the people of Scotland and in the descendants of Scotland, scattered across the world, in anyone who looks at the night sky and feels, without quite knowing why, that it is saying something, that the patterns up there mean something, that there is a connection between what is out there and what is in here, between the movements of celestial bodies and the rhythms of a human life. That feeling is not superstition, it is not primitive, it is the deep inheritance of a very long tradition of paying attention, the biological expression of 15,000 years of people looking at the sky and taking it seriously. The Scots carry that too. Older than Britain. Older than any of the cultural forms that have given it expression in the historical period. Older than anything. Just the long, continuous, unbroken human act of being alive in a place and paying attention. Rest with that now. Let the stars turn overhead. The same stars that turned over Callanish 5,000 years ago, and over the Iberian refugium 45,000 years ago, and over whatever landscape the first fully modern humans inhabited, whenever the full flowering of human consciousness first occurred. The same stars, the same awareness looking up at them, the thread that long, the blood that old. You are part of it too. However you got here, wherever here is for you tonight. The human story is one story, and it is very, very old. Sleep well. One last thought before we truly close. The word heritage comes from the Latin hereditas, meaning inheritance, what you receive from those who came before you, what you pass to those who come after, the chain of transmission across time. We usually think of heritage in cultural terms, the language, the music, the food, the customs, the stories, the things that a community passes from one generation to the next through conscious effort and deliberate teaching, the things you have to learn that require effort and attention and the cooperation of other people who hold the tradition. But there is another heritage, older and more fundamental and requiring no teaching at all, the biological heritage, the inheritance that passes automatically, invisibly, in the most intimate possible act of biological continuity, parent to child, through the same mechanism that has preserved every species that has ever existed on this planet for as long as life has persisted here. The cultural heritage of Scotland is remarkable. The Gaelic language, with its extraordinary oral literature and its music of heartbreaking beauty and its specific way of organizing experience that is like no other language in the world. The Scottish Enlightenment, which produced some of the most important thinkers of the modern world. The tradition of education and intellectual rigor that made Scotland, in the 18th and 19th centuries, one of the great centers of knowledge in the world. The Highland tradition of music and dance and story, the border tradition of ballad and poetry, the urban tradition of wit and radical politics that gave the world so many of the ideas that shape how we live. All of this is real. All of this is worth preserving and celebrating and transmitting. But beneath all of it is the biological heritage, the oldest thread, the one that does not require teaching, that does not require effort, that passes automatically through the generations. The genetic inheritance from the first people who were ever in this landscape. The bloodline that is older than Britain itself. And that biological heritage is also worth knowing, worth understanding, worth honoring, not as a source of pride or superiority or exclusion, but as a fact about the depth of the human story in one particular place. A fact that connects living people to a past so vast that it reshapes the way you think about what history is and what it means. History, in the conventional sense, is the record of what happened after writing was invented. Everything before that is prehistory, which the word implies is somehow less real, less knowable, less significant than the historical period. But the biological record does not share that assumption. The genetic record reaches back through prehistory into a past for which there is no written word, reaching back to the very first human presence in these islands and connecting it directly to the living present. In that perspective, what we call history is actually a very small part of the story. The written record of the last 5,000 years is the surface. The biological record of the last 15,000 years, or the last 50,000 years, or the last 200,000 years is the depth. And the depth is where the most important things happened, where the fundamental human capacities were developed, where the traditions that all subsequent cultures have built on were established, where the thread that connects us to the very beginning of being human in this part of the world was first laid down. That thread runs through Scotland, through the Western Highlands and the islands and the ancient coasts of the Atlantic fringe, through the people who carry the oldest continuously surviving genetic heritage in the British Isles. They are not ancient. They are present. They are alive. They are the living expression of a biological continuity that spans the full extent of the human story in this part of the world. The bloodline is older than Britain, and it is still here, in the DNA, in the stones, in the sea, in the long, patient, unbroken chain of life in one of the oldest inhabited landscapes in the world. Good night, and thank you for listening. There is a particular kind of silence that descends over the Outer Hebrides on a clear winter night, when the wind drops and the sea goes still and the stars come out with a clarity that people who live in cities never see. It is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of fullness, the silence of a place that holds more than words can say. In that silence, if you are patient and very quiet, you can sometimes feel something that has no proper name in English. The Gaelic tradition has words for it. Gianalas, a kind of bittersweet longing for something ancient and half-remembered. Tir nan og, the land of the young, the eternal land beneath or beyond the ordinary world where time does not pass and the old ones still live. Caol ait, the thin place, the place where the boundary between this world and whatever lies beneath it is thin enough to feel. These are the words of a tradition that has been trying, for centuries, to describe something that the landscape of the Atlantic fringe consistently produces in people who pay attention to it. Not a supernatural experience, not a hallucination, but a genuine perception of depth, of the presence of a past that is not really past, of the thickness of time in a place that has been human for a very long time. That perception is not imaginary. It is the natural response of a human nervous system evolved to read social and ecological history, to a landscape that is saturated with social and ecological history. When you stand among the Callanish stones, or on the ancient shore of a Hebridean sea loch, or in the shadow of one of the great Broch towers of the Atlantic coast, you are in a place where the human past is very close to the surface, where the accumulated presence of many generations of lives is written into the landscape in ways that attentive people can feel. The stones that you can see and touch and lean against were placed there by people whose biological descendants are still in these islands. The land that you are standing on was farmed and fished and walked over by people whose genes are still in the population. The sea that you can smell from where you stand was navigated by people whose capacity for navigation, whose knowledge of currents and tides and weather, was the foundation on which everything that came after was built. This is the thin place. This is where the distance between the present and the deep past becomes genuinely small, where the thread of biological continuity is visible, or almost visible, to anyone who knows what to look for. And the Scots, more than most people, know what to look for, because they carry the thread in their own bodies. The Cyanallas that the Gaelic tradition describes, that particular bittersweet longing that the landscape of the Atlantic fringe produces in the people who belong to it, is not nostalgia in the ordinary sense. It is something older. It is the biological response of a people in the place that made them. The recognition, however unconscious, of a connection that goes further back than any individual life can reach. The bloodline is older than Britain. The longing is older than the bloodline. It is the longing of life for its origins, of the present for the past that produced it, of the people for the place that shaped them over 15,000 years of continuous and unbroken presence. That is what you carry, if you carry this blood. That is what the stones are saying, in the language of alignment and astronomical precision and the sheer fact of still being there after 5,000 years. We were here. We are here. The thread holds. Let it carry you into sleep now, into whatever the night brings, into the old country that exists beneath ordinary consciousness, the country that the mythologies of the Atlantic fringe have always described as real and as reachable in the right states of awareness. The Tir Nan Og of the old tradition is not a fantasy. It is a description of something true about the human experience of deep time, of the way the past persists in the present, of the way the dead continue to be present in the living, through the biological fact of inheritance and the cultural fact of tradition. The people who built Callanish are not gone. They are in the cells of the people who live within sight of those stones today. They are in the genes of the Scottish diaspora, scattered across the world, but carrying their Atlantic heritage with them wherever they go. The thread holds. It has always held. Sleep well, wherever you are tonight. Whatever corner of the world has claimed you, or that you have claimed, the old blood is with you. The oldest thread in the British Isles, running unbroken from the beginning to the present moment, is in the people who carry it, wherever they are. The bloodline is older than Britain, and it will endure. Good night.